On January 31, 1982, it was an unremarkable night, but Kathy Durst, 29, disappeared. Years passed, and the silence around her disappearance remained until something far more disturbing emerged. In another state, a man was killed, his body dismembered and scattered in the ocean. Then, a close friend, someone who may have known too much about the past, was found shot execution-style in her own home. Each event seemed isolated at first, but slowly, a pattern began to form. The same name, appearing again and again, always just out of reach of justice. For many years, Robert Durst was a rich and mysterious figure suspected of being involved, but he avoided consequences. Eventually, the truth about him started to come out. Kathy was a medical student. Friends remember her as ambitious, intelligent, and resolute. She had goals, a medical career, and a life independent of her difficult marriage. Her future was cut short, somewhere between her home in South Salem and Manhattan. Robert Durst stated that the evening was typical. He said they argued, something he implied was common. He then claimed he drove her to a train station so she could go back to the city. But no one saw her there. Kathy didn't have a confirmed train ticket, and no one saw her on the train. Her medical school reported her missing when she stopped going to classes. Her friends got worried when she didn't answer their calls. Kathy was a creature of habit and wouldn't just vanish. The timeline began to fracture almost immediately. Investigators noted inconsistencies in Robert's statements. Small details. Changing sequences. According to police reports, he initially said he last saw her at home. Later, the train station narrative appeared. These shifts did not align with a husband calmly recounting events. They suggested something else, something rehearsed. Friends of Kathy painted a darker picture. They spoke of fear, of alleged abuse. According to witness statements later gathered, Kathy had confided that she wanted to leave Robert, that she was afraid of what he might do as she did. There was another detail, one that lingered quietly in the background. Kathy had an appointment with a doctor shortly before her disappearance. Some reports suggest she was preparing for a major life change, possibly separation, possibly something more private. The investigation files would later reference these elements, though not all were fully confirmed at the time. Her things were still there, untouched. She hadn't packed. She didn't leave a note. Her bank accounts showed no activity. There was no sign she had gone anywhere. A life paused mid-sentence. Despite the growing suspicion, the case did not escalate as quickly as it should have. According to later reviews, crucial early hours were lost. Evidence was never secured. The scene was never treated as a crime. And Robert was still free. The silence surrounding Kathy's disappearance was not just an absence. It was the beginning of something deeper, a void that would expand over decades. Before the disappearance, there was a marriage already unraveling. Robert Durst was born into wealth. The son of Seymour Durst, a powerful New York real estate magnate, he grew up surrounded by privilege, expectation, and quiet scrutiny. From the outside, his life appeared structured, even enviable. But those who knew him often described something distant beneath the surface. According to later testimony, he carried a long history of emotional instability, though much of it remained private for years. Kathy McCormick entered that world from a different direction. She was not born into wealth. She built her path deliberately. By the early 1980s, she was enrolled in medical school, working toward becoming a pediatrician. Friends described her as disciplined, warm, and deeply committed to her future. Her relationship with Robert Durst, however, slowly began to overshadow everything she had worked for. At first, the marriage appeared functional, but beneath it, tension accumulated. According to statements gathered by investigators and later presented in court proceedings, Kathy confided in close friends that the relationship had become controlling and volatile. She allegedly described instances of physical abuse. One friend later testified that Kathy had shown her injuries. Another recalled Kathy saying, "If something happens to me, look at Robert." These were not casual remarks. They were warnings. Financial power also played a role. Robert Durst had access to vast family resources, while Kathy remained financially dependent during her studies. According to investigative accounts, this imbalance created a dynamic where leaving the marriage was not simple. It required planning, timing, and risk. By early 1982, those plans appeared to be forming. Kathy reportedly began discussing divorce. She spoke about reclaiming control over her life. There were indications she was preparing documents. According to some accounts in the investigation file, she had also sought medical attention related to personal matters, details that were never fully disclosed publicly, but suggested she was navigating significant changes. Robert Durst, according to multiple witnesses, did not take these developments lightly. Friends recalled escalating arguments, increasing tension, a sense that the situation was approaching a breaking point. One acquaintance later described the relationship as dangerous in its final weeks. Then came the final weekend. On January 30 and 31, 1982, they were together at their home in South Salem. According to Durst, nothing unusual occurred beyond a routine disagreement. But according to Kathy's friends, she'd sounded distressed shortly before she disappeared. One call, in particular, stood out. She reportedly told a friend she was afraid. That fear was never resolved. Because by the next day, Kathy Durst was gone, and the marriage that had been quietly collapsing became the center of a growing suspicion, one that would linger for decades, unanswered, unresolved, and increasingly impossible to ignore. Shortly after Kathy was reported missing, the dean of her medical school received a phone call. A woman, identifying herself as Kathy, claimed she was sick and would not attend classes. The voice was brief, unverified. According to later investigation summaries, the call raised more questions than answers. Some investigators suspected it may have been staged. The identity of the caller was never conclusively confirmed. In the days following January 31, 1982, Kathy Durst was officially reported missing. Her absence was immediate and absolute. She failed to attend classes at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. She did not contact friends. She left behind her belongings, her plans, her future. Nothing suggested a voluntary disappearance. Yet the response was slow. According to investigative records, the case was initially treated as a missing person situation, not a potential crime. This distinction mattered. It meant no immediate securing of the home, no rapid forensic sweep, no early preservation of evidence that might later have changed everything. Robert Durst remained the central figure in the timeline. He told investigators he had last seen Kathy the night before. He dropped her off at the train station, that she intended to travel back to Manhattan. But the details around this account remained fragile. No independent witness confirmed her presence at the station. No conductor or passenger came forward. The timeline relied almost entirely on Durst's word. On February 1, Robert Durst called Kathy's workplace to report her absence. It was an unusual move. By that point, according to his own timeline, he had already dropped her at the train station the night before. Why report her missing so quickly, before others had fully realized she was gone? Investigators would later revisit this detail as part of a broader pattern of behavior. Kathy's family pushed for more. Her loved ones did not accept the passive pace of the investigation. They raised concerns about Robert Durst's behavior, about the inconsistencies, about the history of alleged abuse. But according to later accounts, their concerns struggled to gain traction against the influence surrounding the Durst name, because Robert Durst was not just a husband. He was part of one of New York's most powerful real estate families. That influence, according to some investigators and journalists who later revisited the case, may have slowed the intensity of early scrutiny. Key opportunities were missed. Leads were not aggressively pursued. The case began to drift, not closed, but not advancing. And then it went cold. Nobody was found. No confirmed sighting. No definitive crime scene. Just absence. Almost 20 years went by. Kathy Durst's disappearance was still a mystery, with no answers or closure. Robert Durst had not been accused of any crime. He had moved away from New York, cut ties with his family, and avoided attention. Public records showed he started living an unstable and wandering lifestyle. Then, in 2000, he reappeared, far from Manhattan in Galveston, Texas. But he was not living as Robert Durst. He called himself Dorothy Steiner, a mute woman. According to police records and later court testimony, Durst rented a modest apartment under this identity. He disguised himself in wigs, loose clothing, and silence. Neighbors described Dorothy as strange but harmless, quiet, withdrawn. No one suspected they were living next to a wealthy New York heir connected to a decades-old disappearance. Then came Morris Black, who was Durst's neighbor. Elderly, volatile according to some accounts. The two men, though one was believed to be a woman, developed an uneasy relationship. Witnesses later described arguments, tension, a proximity that felt unstable. On September 28, 2001, Morris Black disappeared. Days later, Galveston Bay began to reveal what had happened. I gasp! Body parts were discovered floating in the water, wrapped in plastic bags, severed cleanly. The remains were identified as Morris Black. The dismemberment was precise, deliberate. According to forensic analysis, it required time, tools, and composure. The investigation led directly to Durst. Police searched his apartment. Blood traces were found. Evidence consistent with a violent struggle. Durst fled. According to law enforcement records, Durst was captured weeks later in Pennsylvania. He was in possession of cash, disguises, and a firearm. Despite having access to significant wealth, he had withdrawn small amounts of money over time, reportedly to avoid detection. Durst admitted to killing Morris Black. He claimed it was self-defense. According to his statement, Black had confronted him in the apartment. A struggle ensued over a gun. The weapon discharged. Black was killed unintentionally. The dismemberment, Durst argued, was not premeditated violence but panic. The case moved toward trial. And for the first time, Robert Durst would face a jury. In 2003, Robert Durst stood trial in Galveston, Texas, for the murder of Morris Black. Durst admitted to dismembering Black's body and disposing of the remains in Galveston Bay, admissions corroborated by forensic evidence. What remained in question was intent. The prosecution argued that the killing was deliberate, that Durst, living under a false identity, had lured Black into a confrontation that escalated into murder. They pointed to the calculated dismemberment, the disposal of the body, the flight across state lines. These were not the actions of a man in panic, they argued, but of someone trying to erase a crime. But the defense told a different story. What? Durst's legal team framed him as a man living in fear. They described Morris Black as aggressive and unpredictable. According to Durst's account, Black had discovered his true identity and confronted him. A struggle followed. A gun was involved. It discharged during the altercation. Yeah! He was calm and spoke about the killing in a disturbingly detached way. He confessed to cutting up Black's body, saying he did it out of shock and fear. He testified that he panicked after the shooting and chose to hide what happened instead of reporting it. For many observers, this admission alone seemed enough to ensure conviction. But the law required more. The jury had to determine whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the killing was intentional and not an act of self-defense. And in that space, between brutality and legal definition, the case began to fracture. There were gaps. No eyewitness to the moment of the shooting. No definitive proof of premeditation. The prosecution's narrative relied heavily on inference, on behavior after the fact. Disturbing behavior, but not necessarily proof of intent at the moment of death. In November 2003, the verdict was delivered. Robert Durst was found not guilty of murder. Everyone was astonished and couldn't believe their eyes. A man who confessed to killing and dismembering someone was released. Durst was later convicted of lesser charges related to evidence tampering and bail jumping. Susan Berman is a journalist, a writer, the daughter of a Las Vegas mob figure. She lived in Los Angeles, in a modest home on Benedict Canyon Drive. But more importantly, She was one of the few people who knew Robert Durst closely and had known him for decades. According to multiple accounts, she had been his confidant and possibly his protector. In the years following Kathy Durst's disappearance, investigators noted something unusual. A woman had called the police, identifying herself as a medical student, to report Kathy missing. The call helped establish an early timeline. For years, its origin remained unclear. Later, according to investigative findings and witness testimony, suspicion grew that Susan Berman may have been that caller. If true, it placed her at the center of a crucial moment, one that potentially helped shape the narrative around Kathy's disappearance. By late 2000, the case had begun to regain attention. The Westchester County District Attorney's Office reopened inquiries into Kathy Durst's disappearance. According to reports, investigators were preparing to speak with individuals connected to the original case. Susan Berman was one of them. She was expected to be interviewed. On December 23, 2000, she was found dead in her home, shot once in the back of the head, execution style. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. According to police reports, it appeared she had opened the door for someone she knew, or at least trusted. The timing was impossible to ignore. Just as investigators were preparing to revisit Kathy's case, a key potential witness was silenced. Years later, that letter would become one of the most critical pieces of evidence in the entire Durst case. No immediate arrest followed. No clear suspect was charged. The case lingered, much like Kathy's disappearance, open but unresolved. Still, investigators began to see a pattern: a missing wife, a murdered confidant, and a man who seemed to exist at the center of both stories, always nearby, always connected, yet never fully accountable. In 2000, the Beverly Hills Police Department received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a brief message directing officers to Susan Berman's home, referring to the location of a cadaver. The note contained no signature. At the time, it was treated as a lead. Years passed. Then, in 2010, filmmakers working on what would become the HBO documentary The Jinx began re-examining Robert Durst's life. During their research, they uncovered a separate envelope, one Durst had sent years earlier to Susan Berman. The handwriting was strikingly similar. Same block letters, same spacing, same peculiarities, and one detail stood out above all. Both envelopes misspelled Beverly Hills in the same way. According to forensic document examiners later involved in the case, this was not a coincidence. The probability of two unrelated writers making the same unusual error in the same format was extremely low. The connection between Durst and the anonymous cadaver note began to solidify. During the filming of The Jinx, Durst agreed to a series of interviews. Calm, composed, and often evasive, he appeared to navigate the questions carefully. After one interview, Durst went to the bathroom. His microphone was still on. What followed was captured on audio. He spoke to himself, fragments of sentences, disjointed. Then, a line that would echo across every investigation tied to his name: "What the hell did I do?" Killed them all, of course. The statement was not made in court. It was not a formal confession, but it was real, recorded, unfiltered, and when paired with the handwriting evidence, it became something investigators had never truly possessed before: a direct connection. Robert Durst was arrested in New Orleans in March 2015 for the murder of Susan Berman. Authorities moved quickly. According to law enforcement reports, Durst had been preparing to flee. He was found with cash, a fake ID, and a loaded firearm. The arrest in 2015 marked the beginning of the end. After decades of evasion, Robert Durst was no longer a figure moving quietly between suspicion and freedom. He was now at the center of a formal prosecution, charged with the murder of Susan Berman. The case would take years to reach trial, delayed by legal battles, health issues, and procedural complexities. But when it finally began in 2021, the narrative that had lingered for decades was laid out in full. This time, the pieces aligned. Prosecutors presented the killing of Susan Berman not as an isolated act, but as part of a broader pattern. According to the state's case, Berman was murdered because she knew too much about Kathy Durst's disappearance. She was a witness who could not be allowed to speak. The cadaver note became central. Handwriting experts testified that the anonymous letter sent to police matched Durst's writing. The unusual misspelling, the structure, the form. These were not coincidences, they argued, but identifiers. A signature hidden in plain sight. Durst's recorded words from the jinx were introduced in court. Oh! The defense challenged their context, arguing they were fragmented, taken out of sequence. But the impact remained. The jury heard his voice, unfiltered, disturbingly calm. Witnesses added depth. Friends, investigators, and those connected to the original cases described a man capable of control, secrecy, and calculated action. The prosecution constructed a timeline that stretched from 1982 to 2000 and beyond, linking disappearance, silence, and execution. Durst testified again. As he had in Texas years earlier, he spoke with composure. But under cross-examination, contradictions emerged. According to courtroom reporting, his statements shifted. Details changed. The consistency that had once shielded him began to fracture under sustained pressure. In September 2021, Robert Durst's verdict was delivered. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kathy Durst's body was never found, and Robert Durst was never directly charged in her disappearance. However, his conviction for Susan Berman's murder suggested that he killed Berman to silence her about Kathy's disappearance, implying his guilt in Kathy's case and suggesting violence was used to maintain that silence. Justice, delayed for nearly 4 decades, had finally arrived in part, but it was incomplete. In January 2022, just months after his conviction, Robert Durst died in prison at the age of 78. His death closed the legal proceedings. It ended the possibility of further trials. It sealed certain answers while leaving others permanently unresolved. Kathy Durst was never found. Her family never received the full truth in a courtroom. No formal verdict ever spoke her name as a victim of murder. Yet across investigations, testimonies, and decades of inquiry, her absence remained the origin of everything that followed. A life interrupted. A silence that shaped 3 cases and a man who, for most of his life, existed just beyond accountability until evidence, time, and his own words finally converged. The case leaves behind more than a verdict. It leaves a lesson about power, about persistence, and about the cost of delays in justice. Because sometimes the truth does not disappear. It waits. And when it returns, it brings everything with it. Welcome back to our channel. Today we will explore a new case, the case of Robin Doan. This story takes place on a remote farm in a small town called Pampa in Texas, USA. 10-year-old Robin Doan was the daughter of Michelle Conrad. She lived with Michelle, her stepfather, Brian Conrad, and her older brother, Zach. The family owned a farmhouse in the area where Brian successfully managed a farming business. The children were raised in a peaceful, rural environment. After divorcing the children's biological father, Michelle met Brian, a kind and pleasant man who quickly formed a strong bond with her children. Life improved for Michelle, and she eventually married Brian. The family had been living happily together for several years. By September 2005, Michelle was 6 months pregnant, and the whole family was eagerly anticipating the arrival of the baby. Brian, in particular, was thrilled at the thought of becoming a father. Meanwhile, Robin, a determined and resourceful 10-year-old, was living the typical life of a schoolgirl. She shared close relationships with her mother, brother, stepfather, and even her biological father, who occasionally visited her. Robin also spent some summers with her biological dad. On the evening of September 30, 2005, Robin went to bed as usual, but was suddenly awakened in the middle of the night. At first, she thought she was trapped in a nightmare When she heard her mother screaming and the explosion, it quickly became clear that this was no dream. Something terrible was happening downstairs. Overcome with fear but driven by curiosity, Robin got out of bed and moved to her bedroom door to listen. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, stopping right outside her room. The door creaked open, and Robin quickly leapt back into her bed, her heart racing. She lay perfectly still, trying to suppress her rising fear. Suddenly, the explosion shattered the silence. 2 bullets narrowly missed her, one passing just inches from her left leg and another near the left arm. The 3rd bullet hit a nearby piece of furniture. In the darkness, the attacker didn't realize they had missed her. They then moved to the next room, where Robin's brother, Zach, was asleep. Moments later, more explosions echoed through the house, followed by a faint, heartbreaking cry from Zach. Then, everything fell eerily silent as the attacker left. Robin was frozen with fear, her body paralyzed. She pretended to be dead, using every ounce of willpower to stay perfectly still, too terrified even to breathe deeply, terrified that the attacker might return, notice her alive. In 2.5 hours of panic, she remained in that state, unable to process what had just happened. When she finally managed to summon the courage to move, there were no signs of the intruder. Summoning her strength, Robin cautiously got up. She grabbed her phone and called 911. Though every step and movement was filled with dread that the assailant might still be nearby. Her voice trembling, Robin identified herself as a scared 10-year-old girl seeking help. Through tears, she told the operator she was cold and frightened. Between sobs, she explained that she had heard her mother's screaming and explosion, but had been too afraid to leave her room to check on her family. She feared the worst, knowing hours had passed without any sound or sign of life from her loved ones. Robin eventually went to the kitchen and gazed out the window, anxiously waiting for the police to arrive. As soon as she saw the flashing lights of the patrol cars, she rushed outside to meet the officers. The little girl, visibly shaken and distressed, was escorted to one of the patrol cars for her safety. Meanwhile, several officers prepared to investigate the house, anticipating the possibility that the attacker might still be inside and ready to confront them. Inside the house, the police discovered a horrifying crime scene. The entire family had been brutally murdered. Brian had been attacked 3 times, Michelle 6 times, and even the family dog had been attacked twice. Robin's brother Zach was killed in his sleep, and one of the bullets struck him directly in the head. Michelle, who was just 2 months away from giving birth, was also tragically killed, and her unborn baby did not survive. Shell casings found at the scene matched a rifle, which was typically purchased through special orders or produced in limited quantities. Throughout this time, Robin remained in the patrol car, waiting for news about her family. She held on to a thin hope that someone had survived. When an officer returned and confirmed that the perpetrator had fled the scene, Robin felt a brief moment of relief. However, the devastating truth about her family's fate was soon revealed to her. Robin began crying again as she fully grasped that her loved ones had been killed. The police informed her that she needed to go to the station to speak with detectives. However, before leaving, Robin asked the officers to help her feed the animals so she could try to calm herself. During this time, she appeared detached from reality. While feeding her goats in the barn, she spoke as though nothing had happened, reminiscing about how she and her brother had won prizes in a competition. But then, she suddenly broke down again, crying as she grabbed one of the officers by the shoulder and desperately asked when her loved ones would come out of the house. The officer had to gently remind her once more that she was the only survivor of the tragedy. Robin was first taken to a nearby medical center for care. The psychologists were assigned to work with her, but this would take time. Doctors examined Robin and confirmed that she was physically unharmed. As a result, the police brought her to the station both to speak with her and to ensure her safety. Meanwhile, detectives understood they were dealing with a dangerous criminal and needed to act quickly to prevent another attack. Robin cooperated with the detectives and provided information to the best of her ability. However, Robin did not witness the events firsthand. Detectives initially suspected that her stepfather or mother might have had a serious conflict with someone shortly before the incident, but this theory was ruled out. Robin denied any such conflicts. Another possibility emerged. that someone in her family might have been involved with dangerous individuals or illegal substances, but Robin dismissed this as well. She couldn't think of anyone who might hate her family enough to attack them with a weapon. Although she described what she heard in great detail, she couldn't identify the attacker. She hadn't gotten a clear look, only catching a glimpse of a dark silhouette. As a result, she was unable to provide any useful description. The only thing she was certain of was that the attacker had light skin. One critical piece of information did stand out. Robin distinctly remembered hearing 15 explosions and confidently reported this number. She later revised her statement slightly, noting that there were clearly more than 10 explosions. When the crime scene was examined, investigators found shell casings confirming that exactly 15 explosions were fired. It seemed surprising that a 10-year-old girl, especially under such terrifying circumstances, could recall this detail so accurately. The situation remained unclear. No motive for the attack had been established, nor had the perpetrator's intentions. It was possible the attacker wanted to eliminate everyone in the household and leave no loose ends. There was even a risk that they might return to target Robin, the sole witness, to complete their plan. For Robin's safety, she will be placed in a specialized center for victims of violence. There, Robin was under the care of her biological father, stepmother, and stepsister, with police officers also stationed at the facility. Now, her father was the only person able to support and help her. He arrived in the middle of the night to pick Robin up, and after her interrogation was completed, they were immediately escorted to the center. Robin was informed that these precautions were necessary for her protection, and she was not allowed to leave the facility. She understood this, as she also herself feared another attack. Despite the restriction on leaving, Robin had to attend her family's funeral. She was allowed to go, but only under police escort. The funeral drew a large crowd from the nearby town, as many people knew the family and spoke about them fondly. In this small agricultural town in Texas, everyone was deeply saddened by the tragedy. For Robin and the mourners, the sight of the 3 coffins at the memorial was unbearable. No one could have imagined that these kind people could die so tragically. Detectives saw the funeral as an opportunity. The time and location of the service were not kept secret. In fact, the police hoped the attacker might show up. If the perpetrator planned to strike again, the funeral would have been the perfect moment. Law enforcement was fully prepared to act, closely monitoring the crowd while keeping a watchful eye on Robin, who was accompanied by her father, stepmother, and stepsister. But the event passed without any suspicious activity. By this point, forensic experts had finished examining the crime scene. They uncovered evidence that might assist in identifying the perpetrator, but no solid leads pointed directly to the murderer. Still, the findings were notable. Inside the house, they found shoe prints, and outside, near the house, they discovered tire tracks. The experts collected all the prints and carefully analyzed the tire tread patterns. Unfortunately, no fingerprints or DNA belonging to the attacker were recovered. The lack of fingerprints led investigators to believe the attacker had worn gloves. The only blood found at the scene was that of the victims, suggesting the perpetrator was uninjured. It seemed the family was caught off guard and had no opportunity to resist or fight back. The back door of the house had been forced open, indicating a break-in. However, despite the presence of valuable items, including a wallet with cash, nothing was stolen from the home. Detectives determined that robbery was not the motive behind the attack. The assailant's behavior didn't match that of someone acting impulsively or under the influence of banned substances or alcohol. Instead, the killer acted with intention and precision, methodically eliminating the family members one by one. The police thoroughly investigated of Brian, Michelle, and Zach, but found no suspicions. No one had a motive, and everyone appeared to be kind, peaceful, and conflict-averse. Robin's biological father had been with his family in a nearby town, and his wife confirmed he was home asleep that night. Eventually, all leads came to a standstill as no one in the family's circle seemed to fit the profile of a suspect. However, such a violent act targeting both adults and children suggested the possibility of a strong motive, such as jealousy, revenge, or resentment. The day before Robin's family was murdered, in the small town of Pineville, Missouri, relatives of the McCool family have attempted to contact them without success. By evening, worried relatives had arrived at the McCool family home. To their shock, the house was empty and surrounded by police tape. A neighbor informed them that a terrible crime had occurred. The night before, Orly McCool and Dawn McCool were killed by an unidentified attacker. At that time, forensic investigators were still processing the scene. They also questioned the relatives who arrived, but no one could provide any helpful information about a possible suspect. Inside the house, investigators found some unusual shell casings of an uncommon caliber, rare and difficult to obtain in the U.S. The following day, another incident in the same area provided a key lead. A local resident, Mr. King, returned to his home after being away for several days on a work trip. He discovered that his house had been broken into. His weapon safes had been forced open and emptied. Among the stolen items was a rare firearm in the U.S., along with ammunition. This strongly suggested a connection between the burglary and the murder of the McCool family. The assailant had likely stolen the weapon from King before committing the crime. Mr. King was thoroughly investigated, but he had a solid alibi. He was out of town at the time of the attack. However, several members of his family could have had access to the weapon. Among them, one person stood out: Levi King, the son of King. Levi was on the run, and family members suspected he was connected to the McCool murders. Thanks to Mr. King's report, detectives had a photo of the suspected killer. At just 20 years old, Levi was already well known to authorities due to his criminal history, which included serving time for burglary. A few years earlier, Levi had broken into a neighbor's house, stolen valuables, and set the property on fire. For this crime, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Just weeks earlier, Levi had been scheduled for transfer to another correctional facility. Desperate for freedom, he escaped during the transfer. Authorities in Missouri were certain Levi was extremely dangerous, armed, and ready to use his weapons at any time. Citizens were alerted through the media, and people were advised not to approach Levi if they encountered him, but to immediately contact law enforcement. Meanwhile, relatives of the McCool family reported several items stolen, including their Dodge Dakota pickup truck. The truck's details were entered into a police database, and a warrant was issued for Levi King's arrest in connection with the crime at the McCool residence. Although Levi King did not know any of the victims personally, he was on the run and needed resources, particularly a vehicle, to leave the state. Eventually, a suspicious young man was stopped by Border Patrol in El Paso, Texas, near the Mexican border, likely attempting to flee the country. During the stop, the young man calmly admitted to having a weapon in his trunk. This led to a more detailed search. During the investigation, they discovered that the pickup truck he was driving was the McCool family's stolen vehicle. Levi was taken to the police station for further investigation. Law enforcement officers decided to question Levi further, and from the start, his behavior seemed odd. Within just 15 minutes of talking to detectives, Levi confessed to the double murder of Orly and Dawn McCool. Levi admitted he couldn't explain why he committed the murders. He said he broke into a random house on the outskirts of town to steal a car, driven only by an overwhelming and uncontrollable desire to kill. When Levi entered the house, he was unexpectedly noticed. A door opened, and a woman appeared, politely asking what he wanted. Levi claimed he was startled and panicked, so he grabbed his weapon and attacked her. Hearing the noise, a man came to investigate, and Levi, paralyzed by fear, also attacked him. After the killings, Levi fled in the pickup truck. Levi was soon extradited to Missouri, where local law enforcement questioned him further. During the interrogation, Levi once again confessed to the murders. Levi made an even more shocking confession. He admitted to murdering the Robin family in Texas. His confession matched evidence from the crime scene of the Robin family's triple murder, including matching shell casings found at both crime scenes. Levi described how he had attacked defenseless members of the Robin family and, upon hearing noises upstairs, discovered others in the house. Among them was Robin, who awoke to the explosion. Driven by uncontrollable bloodlust, the killer showed no regard for the victims' ages. Levi went upstairs, entered the bedrooms, and attacked the occupants in their beds to eliminate any witnesses. After committing these horrific acts, Levi fled the scene. After Levi confessed to the crimes, the police quickly contacted their colleagues in Texas to verify the details he had provided. Once again, his account aligned with the evidence. With this confirmation, Robin was finally able to feel some relief. She had been under immense stress for days, unable to sleep. The next day, investigators from Texas arrived to take Levi into custody. During the transfer, showing no remorse, Levi openly described his emotional state before, during, and after the murders. He admitted that the feelings he experienced during the murders were more intense and pleasurable than any banned substance. Even hours after committing the killings, he claimed he could still smell gunpowder, which gave him a sense of euphoria. In a formal, video-recorded statement, he detailed his actions, starting with the murder of the McCool family. Levi explained that his urge to kill coincided with his need for a vehicle to escape toward the Mexican border. Along the way, he felt another uncontrollable desire to kill and randomly chose the isolated home of the Robin family as his next target. Levi admitted that he did not know any of his victims, including the McCools or the Robins. Realizing the severity of his crimes, he understood he was now facing the death penalty. In an attempt to avoid this, he fled toward Mexico, hoping to disappear. In Missouri, Levi was charged with the double murder of the McCool family. Following his lawyer's advice, he accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. At the same time, hearings for the triple murder and attempted murder in Texas were approaching. Unlike in Missouri, Texas prosecutors took a firmer stance, refusing to rule out the death penalty or consider any plea agreements from the defense. The prosecutor was confident in securing a conviction that would ensure Levi could no longer pose a threat to society. However, death penalty cases often involve lengthy trials and require extensive preparation. Levi spent several years in jail without bail while awaiting trial in Texas. By the time the trial began, Robin, the sole survivor of the Texas attack, was over 14 years old. The hearings took place just before her birthday. On the eve of her 15th birthday, Robin was furious as she realized how senseless and brutal Levi's attack on her family had been. He had no motive and acted purely out of a desire to kill. Understandably, she strongly advocated for him to receive the death penalty. However, Levi's lawyer fought to save his client from execution. Opinions were divided. Some believed Levi did not deserve to live, while others argued that life imprisonment without parole was a harsher and more fitting punishment for his crimes. The defense attorney sought to present Levi King as a more sympathetic figure to influence the jury's decision. He emphasized that Levi had struggled with bipolar disorder since adolescence. Over the years, he had also been diagnosed with depression, psychosis, and schizophrenia. Levi was one of 7 children in a family where he reportedly received little to no love or care. His antisocial behavior was linked to an abusive, alcoholic father and a neglectful, indifferent mother. From as early as elementary school, Levi engaged in troubling acts, including arson, substance abuse, and killing animals for amusement. These behaviors seemed to reflect the dysfunctional environment he grew up in. Levi's abusive father was the first to frequently harm him and expose him to alcohol and banned substances. When police visited Levi's home, they were shocked by what they found. One wall was covered with ceremonial knives, swords, and weapons. Strangely, despite often struggling to afford food, Levi always managed to buy ammunition and weapons. Levi's obsession with violence contradicted the defense's claim that he was a good person shaped by an adverse childhood and environment. The prosecution painted a different picture, portraying Levi King as a predator waiting for his chance to strike. They described him as someone who took pleasure in the smell of blood and gunpowder. The prosecution's main witness was Robin, the sole survivor of Levi's attack. The trial was a deeply traumatic experience for her. She was determined to confront the man who had destroyed her family. Up until that moment, she had been filled with anger and wished for his death. Later, Robin shared her story with journalists. She explained that when she first looked into Levi's eyes in court, she was struck by how empty and cold he seemed. As she saw his lifeless eyes, she forgave him. Robin realized it was pointless to waste energy on someone so devoid of humanity. She understood that Levi could not have become any other kind of person. After about 8 hours of deliberation, The jury decided that the death penalty was too harsh for someone as mentally handicapped as he was. They sentenced Levi to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Levi was eventually extradited to Missouri to serve his life sentence there. For a long time after the attack on her family, Robin struggled with severe psychological trauma. She frequently had nightmares, couldn't sleep well, and was unable to go outside alone. Even years later, the effects of her trauma would resurface. However, thanks to the support of her loved ones, she was able to overcome them. The case of Robin Doan raises many questions about the influence of psychology and deviant behavior. Gaming addiction and the use of high doses of antidepressants may be closely related to a number of factors that cause the psychology of people facing stress or psychological disorders to become unstable, leading to violent behavior. Welcome back to our channel. Today we will explore a new case, the case of Paul Lambert. Our world is full of mysteries, and sometimes danger is closer than we realize. Today's story illustrates how even ordinary events can become a nightmare for someone. Paul Lambert, who was born Paul Scales, was born in 1980 in Queensland, Australia. He had an older sister and several half-siblings from his father's side. When Paul was 4, his parents decided to divorce and agreed that their mother would have custody of the children. Despite facing some challenges during this time, Paul appeared to be a typical child. However, as time went on, his mother began to notice troubling behaviors in him. She took him to a doctor who diagnosed him with a disorder related to his parents' separation, suggesting that it would improve over time. Unfortunately, several years passed and Paul's behavior continued to deteriorate. By the time he was 10, his mother was merely in despair as her son had become completely uncontrollable. He was diagnosed with multiple conditions, including attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and began treatment that seemed to provide some relief. Despite facing many challenges, Paul excelled in school. In 1998, he graduated from high school and enrolled at the Queensland University of Technology to pursue a degree in business and finance. His intelligence allowed him to succeed with ease. After completing his studies, he obtained a job in the finance department of a motorcycle dealership in North Queensland, where he worked as part of a large team. His coworkers found him charming, articulate, intelligent, and friendly, always ready to assist others. He even helped a colleague raise funds for her daughter's medical treatment. However, that is only a part of his personality that he wants to show to everyone. Although he appeared kind and generous, regularly donating to charities and supporting friends and family, his true nature was known only to his family. In reality, he was a manipulator struggling with mental health issues who refused to seek help. A skilled liar, Paul used his eloquence to achieve his aims, often employing threats of self-harm as a tactic to manipulate others. From 2003 to 2010, Paul had several different girlfriends, all of whom were beautiful. However, a troubling pattern emerged in his relationships. He exhibited extreme aggressive behavior. By the 6th year, 5 different women had obtained restraining orders against him. But even this did not stop him. He violated several of them and was held accountable. Paul treated all his ex-girlfriends similarly. They described him as a manipulator who sought to control their lives in a cruel manner. He frequently belittled them emotionally, and even became violent when discussions about breakups arose, creating unsafe conditions for their well-being. Paul had a troubling habit. He would reach out to the families of girls who tried to leave their unsatisfactory relationships. Whenever he sensed that he was losing control, he would repeatedly call the girls' relatives, trying to intimidate and stalk them. His goal was to delay the breakup and keep his latest partner with him for as long as possible. To do this, Paul made up stories and attempted to hide his actions. When the truth came out and difficult conversations started, he often blamed his mental health issues. It seemed he genuinely believed that his disorders could excuse his cruel and irrational behavior. However, the girls and their families insisted that he needed to seek help from a psychiatric clinic. Unfortunately, he did not seek help on his own, and law enforcement did not take action, allowing another girl to fall under his influence. Paul claimed to have dissociative identity disorder, describing his personalities as good and evil, and sometimes giving them names. He admitted that he might have as many as 9 different personas. Despite this, Paul was a charismatic individual with a strong ability to charm women. He was attractive, but his idealized relationships quickly fell apart, typically lasting no more than a month. In 2014, he tried to settle down by proposing to his ex-girlfriend Samantha, whom he had dated in 2008. However, their relationship ended due to his aggressive and cruel behavior, which included stalking her. Although, they remained in contact for 6 years, during which Samantha urged him to seek professional help. Paul managed to persuade her that he could be a good husband and would definitely pursue treatment, leading her to agree to marry him. They officially tied the knot on February 2, 2014. Of course, all his promises turned out to be lies. Initially, things appeared to be going well, but within a few weeks, the situation started to deteriorate rapidly. After 7 months of living together, their marriage had become unbearable. Paul was losing control, and Samantha felt ready to end the relationship for good. In a last-ditch effort to save their marriage, she suggested they take a trip together. In September 2004, they traveled to Orlando, Florida, hoping to improve their relationship before returning to Australia. Although the trip seemed romantic and had the potential to mend their relationship, once they returned home, Paul continued his old behavior. Unsurprisingly, the situation only worsened. Then, Paul creates a profile on Tinder, presenting himself in the best possible way. He received messages from many women, but was searching for something truly special. He connected with Brittany Kill, a beautiful and well-known 32-year-old television presenter with a promising future. Brittany was using the app to find a relationship, and Paul quickly caught her attention. They began messaging, then exchanged social media and email contacts, and eventually had several video calls on Skype. Paul is completely captivated by Brittany to the point where he wants to end his relationship with his wife. In March 2015, Paul informed Brittany that he was going to Florida because he wanted to be with her. By this time, they had developed a good rapport. Brittany had no idea that Paul was hiding significant issues. He was adept at concealing his flaws, and Brittany unwittingly became another victim. When Brittany learned about his divorce, she expressed that she didn't want to be the reason for his family's breakup. She asked Paul to stay in Australia, but he lied, claiming he was already divorced and had no ties holding him back. This convinced Brittany to give him a chance, and she agreed to spend 3 months with him to deepen their connection. Finally, they met in person. Although Paul is not officially divorced, he continued to deceive Brittany. At first, he presented himself as a caring and loving man, but soon, his true nature revealed itself. Brittany noticed his odd and unpredictable behavior, which suggested he was struggling to manage his emotions. As a sensible person, Brittany understood that the relationship should come to an end. Unfortunately, this decision was a clear signal for Paul to take action. He started overwhelming Brittany with messages and calls, insisting she spend the next 3 months with him, as they had initially agreed. He believed she could not simply abandon her commitments, claiming he had traveled across the ocean for her and felt that she had treated him poorly. But all of this was in vain. Paul could not convince Brittany. Then, Paul began telling her that his father had just died and he needed support, claiming that Brittany was the only close person he had in the US. Ultimately, this worked. She believed his story, thinking that no one would make up something like that. Her father had died from a brain tumor a few years ago, so she understood how hard it was for him. Paul knew about this and intentionally used this trick to manipulate her to lure Brittany into a trap. She supported him and tried to build their relationship. Of course, this didn't affect his behavior. He became increasingly unstable, so after a while, Brittany decided to cut ties again. Then, Paul began to threaten to take his own life. Unfortunately, this trick worked again, and their relationship continued. What bothered Brittany most was her boyfriend's behavior when she had to work away from home for long hours. He sent her dozens of messages and emails and could even call her when she was on live air. Naturally, this was a significant problem for the journalist, and could potentially cost her the job she had dedicated her entire life to. Brittany couldn't withstand the pressure and tried to break up with him again. Then, he started making up new absurd stories that became increasingly bizarre. Paul started telling her that all this time, she had not been dating him but his twin brother, who was the one behaving inappropriately. This time, Brittany did not believe these stories. Then Paul recounted how he had been abused in childhood, claiming that this had led to his current emotional state. Paul again tried to elicit pity from Brittany in every possible way. This whole lie culminated in he confessing that he had a brain tumor and would soon die. Paul added that he was afraid of dying alone. He was once again convincing enough for Brittany to believe him. All of this led to the continuation of their relationship, but Samantha lived in constant fear. She cried every day, and panic attacks began. During the day, Brittany was so tense that she felt constantly unwell. She planned to exit the relationship again, but Paul was prepared to keep her. He threatened to expose naked photographs of her. Now her career, which she had built her entire conscious life around, was at stake. Paul even started sending threatening messages on Brittany's social media, calling her a killer and hinting that he would take his own life if she broke up with him. As a result, Brittany was forced to delete several of her social media profiles. As a public figure, she needed to manage her social media presence to promote herself. Naturally, Paul was aware of this and willingly used it as a means of control. All of this could not continue indefinitely. Eventually, Brittany left him and contacted the police. Like all the previous women in this period, he actively bombarded her with compromising messages and stalked her wherever he could. She reported all of this to law enforcement, who took the case seriously. On May 11, Brittany sent a text message to Paul warning him not to stalk her anymore and not to try to contact her through any means of communication. Then Paul sent 2 more letters demanding payment in exchange for stopping his harassment. In reality, Paul earned a decent living from extort money. He was very frugal, drove an old car, and rented a tiny, modest apartment. However, in the following days, Paul still showed no signs of stopping his bullying actions. It seemed he was still trying harder to cling to his victim. During this period, he began talking about his 9 personalities. Brittany was in shock and terrified, as she had never dealt with people suffering from dissociative disorders before. Thanks to Brittany's work through social media and television, Paul was able to easily gather information about her. He followed her through news broadcasts and publications. Paul began showing up near Brittany's home and workplace uninvited, and he was able to intimidate her to the point that it became increasingly difficult for her to go on live broadcasts. During those moments, she couldn't feel calm in front of the camera because of the overwhelming fear. Thanks to the lawyer hired by Brittany, Paul was arrested and charged with stalking and extortion. Eventually, he admitted to stalking, but again claimed he was insane. During this time, Brittany learned that all of his stories about twin brothers and tumors were false. His father was actually alive and well. She was shocked by the extent of his deceit. Soon after, Paul was deported to Australia and banned from entering the US. After being forcibly sent back to his home country, he changed his last name to Lambert, his mother's maiden name. This seemed to be his attempt to clear his name, which had been tarnished by legal issues. When Samantha found out about his deportation, she contacted the police because she was worried he might try to come back to her since they were still married. As a result, the police issued a restraining order against Paul from approaching her. Despite this, Paul continued to harass her with calls and messages, but she chose not to respond. On February 22, 2016, Paul persuaded Samantha to go with him to a divorce lawyer to sign the divorce papers. She agreed, which turned out to be a grave mistake. During the ride, he began to insult her and threatened to crash the car so they could die together. When Samantha asked to be let out, Paul suddenly sped up, and in the panic, he hit her in the face. Fortunately, she managed to escape from the car and call the police. Paul was subsequently arrested and charged with kidnapping and assault. They finalized their divorce on June 19 of that same year, and Paul faced a Queensland court where he was sentenced to 10 months in prison. However, he was released on parole shortly after. Following his release, he was placed on 12 months of probation and had his driver's license suspended for 2 years. A few months later, he broke the terms of his parole again by moving to another state in Australia and starting a new job without informing his parole officer. Initially, law enforcement was unaware of his actions. Each time he was supposed to check in, he flew from state to state, pretending to live his previous life. It was later discovered that he had much more serious problems than simple depression. From August 2015 to May 2016, he attended numerous therapy sessions with a psychologist. During this time, his behavioral issues also came to the attention of psychiatrists. Although Paul was prescribed several medications, he refused to take them and eventually stopped seeing the specialist altogether. Shortly after his divorce from Samantha, Paul began using his favorite dating app and quickly met a new woman. This woman was Angela J., a 28-year-old doctor who had just finished her residency and worked at a hospital in Sydney, located hundreds of kilometers away from him in another state. Angela was also looking for a life partner after her own difficult divorce. Upon meeting Paul, she felt an immediate connection. They went on their first date, followed by several more, during which Paul acted calmly to win her over. Angela noticed they had a lot in common and eventually invited him to meet her family. While she seemed genuinely happy, her father sensed something was wrong within minutes of meeting Paul. He warned his daughter that this man would bring trouble, but sadly, his warning went unheeded. Angela and Paul had an agreement. She would focus on her career and not be disturbed during the weekdays while working at the hospital, and they would meet on weekends. Initially, everything went well, but soon Angela began to feel uneasy. She sensed that someone was watching her and discovered that someone had entered her home without permission while she was at work. Paul started to act increasingly provocatively, prompting Angela to end the relationship. When she shared this news, Paul cried and resorted to his usual tactic of threatening self-harm. When she tried to set boundaries, Paul revealed that he had a personality disorder. He escalated the situation by inventing a fake friend named Dan, buying a phone for this imaginary friend, and using Dan to manipulate Angela further, claiming that he was end his life due to her desire to break up. This made Angela feel guilty. Eventually, she agreed to spend some time with him, feeling pressured by her professional ethics as a doctor who wanted to help. Angela made it clear that she only wanted to support his recovery and did not wish to pursue a romantic relationship, which seemed to satisfy Paul. Then, Angela had invited him to a reunion, and when they met, she reiterated that they were just friends. Throughout the evening, Paul acted unpredictably, even stealing Angela's handbag with all her belongings. After several hours of persuasion from some of Angela's friends, her property was finally returned. Angela's sister came to her aid just in time and helped her escape. By morning, the sisters reached out to the police because they had received threatening messages overnight. Initially, the police did not take action even though they were aware of multiple similar crimes committed by Paul. He had violated 5 restraining orders and the terms of his parole, along with committing various other offenses. The next day, Paul rented a white Corolla hatchback and went to a hardware store to buy a utility knife, an axe, and 2 rolls of tape. While driving, he was pulled over for speeding, but it is more of a routine document check. He was driving illegally since his license was still suspended, but he managed to convince the officer that he was unaware of the restrictions. Surprisingly, the officer let him go. That evening, Paul met Angela at her doorstep right after she returned from visiting her sister. Once inside, Angela received a frightening message from Paul. Alarmed, Angela ran to her neighbors for help, fearing that Paul might come for her. They assisted her and called the police. Help arrived at her home around 9 p.m., and Angela was taken to the police station. After explaining the situation regarding Paul, a criminal case was opened. Following the police's advice, Angela decided to stay with her relatives for safety. She asked the landlord to change all the locks. To protect herself, she kept knives all over her house so she can quickly defend herself in case of attack. Meanwhile, Paul was near her house, hiding from the police and attempting to buy a weapon. Paul went to a weapon shop but was unable to purchase one due to his suspended license. Later, he returned and asked to buy a hunting knife, which he was given. That same day, he rented a room in a hotel directly across from the hospital where Angela worked. After that, he sent a message to the entire family saying he was going to end his life. However, his relatives who had tried to help him for many years were exhausted by his constant lies and stopped responding to such comments. On November 2nd, Paul returned to the hardware store and bought a crowbar, a hammer, and several zip ties. When Angela came home in the evening and went to her bedroom, Paul suddenly jumped out of the closet and attacked her with a knife. He covered her mouth with his hand, leaving her unable to fight back. However, Angela managed to stall him by asking to go to the bathroom. Terrified, she decided to try to escape. Unfortunately, Paul quickly caught up with her and began stabbing her. The first strikes hit her legs, followed by 11 wounds to her chest and arms. Despite her injuries, Angela somehow managed to get up. Paul then poured gasoline on her and even into her mouth, but she refused to give up and screamed for help. Fortunately, a neighbor walking his dog heard her cries. Realizing what was happening, the neighbor grabbed a crowbar from his work vehicle and rushed to her aid. Angela seized the opportunity to slip out of Paul's grasp, causing him to slip on a puddle and fall. This gave her crucial seconds to escape, and the neighbor helped her reach his house, where his wife called for help and tended to her bleeding wounds as instructed by Angela. Finally, Angela was taken to the hospital, and the police began searching for Paul. However, he had already disappeared by that time. Remarkably, around 7:05 a.m., while Angela was being transported to the hospital, Paul called her. Instead of speaking with her, he only heard the furious shouts of the neighbor who had rescued her. Paul hung up and called his mother. During this call, he told her he intended to take his own life and asked her to apologize to Angela on his behalf. She didn't believe him and hung up. He then called the police, speaking about harming all the women he had known. He claimed he couldn't control himself and that they would be in danger as long as he was alive. The police tried to convince him to turn himself in, but he simply hung up. Thanks to this call, the police were able to track Paul's location. He was traveling along the eastern coast of Australia. A chase began at 9:15, but Paul was driving so recklessly that the police had to stop the pursuit. They set up spike strips on the road, which successfully halted his vehicle. Paul exited the rented car with a knife and ran down the road until he encountered 3 officers. Although the officers had their weapons drawn, Paul showed no intention of surrendering. He was blinded by a powerful flashlight, which only made him more aggressive. Meanwhile, the police attempted to negotiate with him, urging him to give up, but he seemed intent on dying. Paul even shouted, asking what he needed to do for the officers to open fire. They attempted to calm and distract him, but one of the police officers approached from behind and fired a taser. Unfortunately, the taser failed to make contact because Paul was wearing thick clothing. This infuriated Paul, who then menaced the officers with a knife. Suddenly, multiple explosions rang out from all directions. At 9:37, 36-year-old Paul was shot and killed. His wife was informed of the incident, but she was unable to cry or feel upset. Angela was in the hospital at the time. She had been saved and was not in danger of losing her life despite suffering 11 stab wounds. Upon hearing that Paul could no longer harm anyone, Angela felt a sense of relief. Many women who had been victims of stalking experienced varying degrees of depression and post-traumatic stress, but ultimately, they all managed to rehabilitate and recover. In the eyes of everyone, Ebby Stepak was a beautiful, strong young woman, yearning for freedom and wanting to assert herself. But in just a moment, her life took a dark turn, full of unpredictable twists. One morning in the fall of 2015 in Little Rock, Arkansas, Ebby left her grandmother's house with a promise to return soon. No one expected that it would be the last time her family saw her. 2 days later, Ebby's car was found in a park. The keys were still in the ignition. Her wallet, phone, and even her contact lenses were still in the car. But Ebby was gone. The family searched frantically while the police hesitated. The days of waiting stretched into months, then years, until a heartbreaking discovery ended all hope. Ebby's body was found in a concrete pipe, just steps from where the car had been abandoned. This is not just a story about a young woman whose future was taken away, but also a tragedy of silence from justice, of missed opportunities, of a family exhausted by waiting and helpless before an investigative system that they have lost faith in. In the darkness that surrounds Ebby Stepak's death, the question remains, who made her disappear and why? Abby Stepback was born on March 31st, 1997 in Little Rock, Arkansas, to Peter and Lori. After her parents divorced, she lived with her mother but stayed in contact with her father. Her family included her brother Trevor, her sister Harris Elizabeth, and her half-brother Ethan, all of whom were part of her life. Michael Jernigan became an important figure to her after marrying her mother and becoming her stepfather. Abby attended Lisa Academy, a private school, where she was diligent, curious, and engaged. In her senior year, however, she transferred unexpectedly to Little Rock Central High, a public school. That change, along with other events in 2015, marked a turning point. Since childhood, Abby longed for independence and was passionate about exploring the world. She loved foreign languages and taught herself Spanish, Turkish, and Hebrew, focusing on pronunciation, intonation, and cultural nuances. Abby loves fashion, makeup, and hair. For her, style is more than just clothes. It's a way to express herself. She changes her appearance often, trying different styles with purpose. Photography was another passion. She captured nature, small details, and city scenes, finding beauty in everyday life. She loved the outdoors, especially the ocean, which brought her peace. She often shared those experiences with friends. Abby's personality was strong, kind, and fair, with little tolerance for hypocrisy. In 2015, she decided to live independently, moving out of her brother Trevor's house to live with friends and her grandmother. Her parents were worried, but for her, it was a big step toward independence. That summer, Abby landed her first job at a Foot Locker store in McCain Mall. At first, her parents were proud of her efforts, but they soon noticed a change. She was homeless often, becoming more distant and unapproachable. New people entered her life, bringing a different energy. She was still bubbly and confident, but she became more stubborn and defiant of authority. Not only was she not afraid of change, she seemed to actively seek it. Those around her sensed the change in her. Around this time, she started dating someone her family didn't trust. They didn't argue with her about it, but they were uneasy and worried the relationship might lead to trouble. As her social circle changed, so did her behavior. Abby began to pull away. Her life moved into a private space her parents couldn't access. After switching to public school, she started skipping classes. The school notified her parents, but conversations at home went nowhere. Abby held firm to her desire for independence and decision-making. Talks about rules and responsibility always ended without resolution. Her parents no longer knew who she was spending time with, and their concern grew as their influence waned. Her close friend Danielle noticed the change too. They had been inseparable at Lisa Academy and remained close after Abby transferred. But that summer, Danielle felt the distance. They no longer shared everything. Abby became guarded and withdrawn, and she didn't want to hang out. Their conversations lost their connection. It felt like Abby was retreating into herself. What worried Danielle most wasn't just Abby's behavior. It was the new group she was with. They were bold, reckless, and confrontational, unlike her former friends. They didn't respect authority and pushed boundaries. Abby seemed drawn to them, as if searching for something she couldn't find elsewhere. Danielle couldn't understand what it was, but she had a sinking feeling these changes weren't temporary. They were lasting. By early fall, tension was rising. Abby was skipping school, staying out without telling anyone where she was, and sometimes disappearing for days. Her parents were very worried, but any attempt to set rules turned into a fight. Abby made it clear she wouldn't accept pressure or control. Her family realized she no longer saw herself as part of them. She was living by her own rules, and they weren't included. For Danielle, that summer ended their friendship. She kept in touch, but Abby grew more distant. Each conversation felt colder. Danielle felt that Abby was rushing into danger, though she didn't say it out loud, and deep down, Danielle knew they were unlikely to ever get back to the way things were. On October 23, 2015, Abby went to a party. Danielle, who had seen her recently, chose not to go. The crowd made her uneasy. The next morning brought shocking news. Abby arrived at her parents' house shaken but composed and said she had been intentionally assaulted by a group the night before. She named 4 young men and insisted the assault had been recorded on a phone. She offered few details. She said she'd been in shock but conscious. She didn't describe what led up to the attack or much about the party. Her message was simple. It happened, and there was video proof. For her mother, Lori, and stepfather, Michael Jernigan, it was a terrible shock. Michael remembered that Evie wasn't asking what to do. She had decided. She wanted to report it. She was clear and determined. They agreed Michael would take her to the police station later that day. They didn't set a time, but it was understood. A few hours later, Evie left. She never returned. Afterward, she only communicated with her family through her grandmother and did not mention again what she had told that morning. That conversation was the only time Evie spoke openly to her family about the attack. The trip to the station never happened. No report was filed. Since her conversation with Michael, she no longer went home, dropped out of school, and gradually withdrew from the world around her. Later, it emerged that on October 24, the same day she told her family, she reached out to Danielle. She said she planned to visit her brother and suggested they meet the next day. She was still making plans and seeking support. This didn't look like withdrawal, it looked like a push for justice after trauma. That morning was more than just a confessional moment. It was a turning point. And for some, perhaps that was also the reason she kept quiet. After opening up to her family, Evie continued to text Danielle, asking to stay the night like before. Danielle agreed. For Evie, it was a way to return to a familiar, safe space with someone she still trusted. Danielle said, Evie seemed tense, acted reserved, and spoke hesitantly. Sometimes Evie mentioned those troubles but didn't go into detail. Danielle didn't press, but sensed Evie was holding back, weighed down by something she wasn't ready to share. After that, Evie asked Danielle to help re-pierce an old earring hole that had closed up. Danielle helped her. The next morning, October 25, Evie left Danielle's place and went to her grandmother Peggy Holman's home. The visit wasn't planned, but Peggy wasn't surprised. Evie often dropped by. The day was calm. They watched SpongeBob, ate ice cream, and talked. Nothing in Evie's mood seemed alarming. She stayed for dinner. Around 8 p.m., she said she needed to meet her stepfather and reminded her grandmother she still planned to go to the police. The plan remained. Before leaving, Evie hugged her grandparents, told them she loved them, and promised to return soon. Nothing in her voice or behavior suggested worry. She seemed calm, confident, and at peace. That was the last time anyone in her family saw her. The final confirmed moment was her departure from her grandmother's house on the evening of October 25. After that, everything is unknown. That's where communication ended, when Evie disappeared. There were no signs she intended to leave or run away. She said she'd be back soon, but she never returned. That broken promise was the first clear warning. That night, around 2 a.m., Evie's brother, Trevor, woke up to hear her calling. He answered immediately. She sounded panicked. She said she was outside his house. Trevor rushed out, but no one was there. No Evie, no car. He called her back. She answered and said she was in her car but didn't know where it was parked. Her voice was unlike anything he'd heard from her before. She sounded confused and detached, unable to describe her location. Then she said that she was gone, and the call ended. That was the last thing she ever said to him. Trevor tried calling repeatedly, but she never picked up. Her phone went silent. About 6 hours had passed between her leaving her grandmother's house and that call, a gap still unexplained. Later, it emerged that Evie made 2 brief calls to emergency services that night, each under a minute. No recording survived. Authorities said they had no technical records, no files, no logs, yet the family confirmed the calls occurred. That discrepancy raised serious questions. No one knows what she was trying to report. Maybe she was in danger, trying to share her location, or believed she was being followed. What is clear is that her actions did not resemble someone planning to disappear. They looked like someone reacting to an urgent threat or a situation spiraling out of control. When they couldn't reach her the next morning, her mother and stepfather called nonstop. At first, the phone rang. Later, it went dead. That change convinced them something was wrong. The next day, they tried to file a missing person report but were turned away. Police said it was too soon and that procedures required waiting before she could be considered missing. Law enforcement leaned toward the idea that Abby left voluntarily. She was an adult, independent, and recently seeking more freedom. Her family disagreed. This was out of character. She had stayed in close contact until the very end. The sudden silence and disappearance didn't fit. From that point on, time was critical. Abby Stepak was officially missing, and the gap between her family's urgency and the authorities' response marked the start of a long series of missed opportunities, longer than anyone imagined. 2 days after Abby vanished, on October 27, 2015, a passerby found her 2003 Volkswagen Passat in an empty lot near Chalamont Park, by the woods. He had seen it there the day before and reported it, but no patrol responded that night. When he called again the next day, police finally checked it out. The car was Abby's. The keys were in the ignition, the gas tank was empty, the battery was dead, and there was no visible damage. Abby's personal belongings were in the car and in the trunk: wallet, clothes, phone, ID wallet, bank cards, and contact lens case. She was nearsighted and could not see clearly without her contact lenses. Leaving behind her phone, wallet, and lenses, things she needed daily, strongly suggested she did not plan to disappear. She didn't bring any money, didn't contact anyone, and left behind even her essential belongings. Everything pointed away from a voluntary disappearance, yet police took no special precautions. They did not tape off the car or treat it as a potential crime scene. The inspection was superficial. The trunk was left open. That night, a heavy rainstorm drenched everything: documents, clothing, and any possible evidence. Abby's belongings were later returned to her parents, water damaged. They had to pack and dry them themselves. Understanding the importance of these pieces of evidence, the family carefully photographed each item, then bagged them and stored them safely at home, hoping to salvage something. Although the car was found, the seriousness of the incident remained unrecognized. There was no formal investigation, no forensic team. The scene wasn't secured or analyzed, an omission many believe cost crucial evidence forever. Items in the car could have held fingerprints, DNA, or other biological material, but none of it was documented or preserved, violating basic investigative procedures. To Abby's family, this made it clear authorities weren't taking her disappearance seriously. A young woman was missing. Her car was abandoned in a remote park with personal items left behind. There was no contact, no indication of a plan, yet still no urgency from police. The car's condition, its location, and what remained inside all suggested she left under duress or in a hurry. She had no known reason to be in that area alone. It didn't make sense. Since then, her family has believed that she did not leave voluntarily. Even so, the investigation stalled. All proposals to expedite the case were met with mechanical, formulaic responses. There were no canvasses of neighbors, no interviews with friends, no organized search of the park where the car was found, and no requests for nearby surveillance footage. Her parents turned to the media, posted flyers, recruited volunteers, and contacted private investigators. But without access to evidence or police databases, their efforts were limited. Each day without official progress made rebuilding the timeline harder. Hope for a breakthrough faded, and the sense of helplessness grew. Nearly 8 months passed before anything changed. Only after mounting public pressure and persistent requests from Abby's parents was the case reclassified. Abby Stepak was officially declared a missing person. This paved the way for a full investigation, but by then, it was too late. Important leads had disappeared. Potential witnesses had moved on or forgotten, and evidence that could have revealed the truth was likely lost. In the spring of 2016, Margie Foley, the mother of a close friend of Abby's, returned to Chalamont Park. It was no ordinary visit. She was still haunted by the place. Abby's car had been found there, and a large concrete sewer pipe ran underground near the parking lot. Police had never shown interest in it, but Margie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As she approached, she smelled a strong, putrid odor, characteristic of decomposition. Certain that something was rotting inside, she called 911. An officer arrived within the hour. Margie pointed to the pipe and described the smell, stressing that it wasn't normal park runoff or trash. The officer stood near the pipe briefly, then stepped back without trying to look inside. He calmly explained that storm drains often collect debris, stagnant water, and organic waste, especially after rain, and that such smells weren't unusual. He said he saw nothing suspicious and didn't plan to investigate further. Margie pressed him to use a flashlight or call in a K9 unit. He refused, insisting there was no sign of a crime. He left without checking the pipe. The incident wasn't documented. There was no report, no follow-up, and no agency inspection. No one connected this detail to Evie's abandoned Volkswagen. It was later discovered that the pipeline was less than 20 meters from where Evie's car was found. Just a glance downward would have revealed it. But because of this negligence, a potential piece of evidence was missed, and the scene remained almost intact for nearly 2 years. For Evie's family, it was heartbreaking. Time dragged on, weeks, months, years, and Evie was still missing. Since the day she disappeared, her family existed in a constant state of waiting. Thousands of days passed with no news and no leads. The uncertainty became its own torment. Law enforcement remained at a standstill. Eventually, Evie's father hired private investigator Monty Vickers, determined not to let the case die. He began with her final communications. What stood out were the messages Evie sent the night before she vanished. In them, she directly confronted several young men she said had assaulted her. Her tone was firm. She planned to go to the police. She mentioned a video and demanded they come forward. She made it clear she would not stay silent. The next day, Evie disappeared. To her family, the connection was obvious. She confronted her alleged attackers, and soon after, she was gone. They believed it wasn't a coincidence, that someone wanted to silence her. Yet police didn't act. They issued no warrants to access the phones of the men Evie had named. Those messages, potentially containing threats, admissions, or vital clues, were never formally examined. The reason given, insufficient cause. Another missed opportunity. Despite Evie naming names and making direct accusations, the investigation stopped at surface-level interviews. No digital footprints were pursued. No devices were seized. The young men remained witnesses, not suspects. Monty repeatedly highlighted systemic failures, lack of urgency, bureaucratic inertia, and no coherent investigative strategy. For 3 years, police didn't revisit those individuals, even as new information emerged. These missteps stalled the case. In fall 2018, a long overlooked detail resurfaced. The concrete drainage pipe in Chalamont Park, near where Evie's car was found in 2015. After 3 years, the police finally conducted a thorough search of the area. The results shocked everyone. Human remains were inside the pipe. The location was alarming, and a preliminary examination showed the remains were female. Within days, the identity was confirmed. It was Evie Stepbach. All along, she'd been just steps from where her car was discovered, right in the same park officers had visited, beside an area dismissed in both 2015 and 2016. It was the very spot previously pointed out, but never thoroughly searched. Because the body was so badly decomposed by time and the environment, investigators were unable to determine a cause of death. The condition of the remains prevented a full forensic analysis. The medical examiner could confirm only one thing: it was a homicide. The body did not end up in the pipe by accident. It was placed there intentionally. Beyond that, there were no conclusive findings, no defensive wounds, no usable biological evidence, nothing to point to a suspect. This discovery changed everything. It proved Evie hadn't simply vanished, she had been there the whole time. If the pipe had been thoroughly searched in 2015, physical evidence might have been preserved. If the odor reported in 2016 had been taken seriously instead of dismissed as sewer smell, investigators might have determined what happened, or even who was responsible. Those chances are gone. The finding brought a bitter sense of finality. Evie was found, but only her body, and her case was officially ruled a homicide. Even so, there was no real progress. Investigators identified no suspects, filed no charges, and presented no clear theory. Even the men Evie named in her final messages, the ones she said had harmed her, were not treated as suspects and were not re-questioned. Her family got no answers. What should have been the beginning of justice became a legal impasse. No physical evidence, no access to key information, no forensic timeline. The case stalled. So did any hope of a trial. All that remained was a confirmed loss of life without a path to accountability. Abby's mother, Lori, took the fight public, speaking on national platforms, giving interviews, and appearing on major TV programs, including an emotional interview on Dr. Gust. Phil. The family offered a $50,000 reward for information, funded by supporters, private donors, and nonprofits committed to their pursuit of justice. Still, no new leads emerged. No one came forward. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or self-preservation, those who might know something stayed silent. The public did not forget. Abby's story continued through podcasts, YouTube investigations, and independent documentaries, kept alive by voices outside the system. Officially, however, there was nothing. Those Abby had named carried on with their lives, jobs, families, freedom. Meanwhile, her loved ones remained in limbo, grieving, waiting, and facing the brutal reality that no one would be held accountable. Suspicions persisted, but suspicions are not evidence. Without hard proof, there would be no charges, no trial, no justice. That is where the story stands. A truth many can see, but that cannot be proved in court. It isn't justice, it's the absence of it. And that is the most painful part of all. When Maria Evelyn Sayos vanished, her daughter, Joanna Marie Sayos, told everyone that her mother had left for Singapore to clear her mind. It sounds reasonable, but the truth is much darker. Strangely enough, during the following period, a foul stench continuously rose from under her kitchen floor. Hidden beneath the floor of the family home, inside an unfinished septic tank, lay a secret that would remain buried for 4 years. But every deception eventually cracks. 4 years later, when workers were breaking up the concrete, they found something horrifying, a body so badly decomposed that it was unrecognizable. The community was shocked when the crime was exposed. This is the case of Maria Evelyn Sayos from the Philippines. The odd story began in 2016. Joanna told her siblings that their mother, Maria Evelyn Sayos, had abruptly traveled to Singapore. According to her, their mother had left in emotional distress, needing time to rest and reflect. The last time the 54-year-old Maria Evelyn Sayos was seen was August 20, 2016. After that day, she simply vanished. The disappearance left her family confused and uneasy. Joanna reassured them that Evelyn stayed in touch through social media messages, sending birthday greetings and short updates. As time passed, doubts only deepened. The messages from Evelyn were short, strangely impersonal. She never initiated video calls, never posted new photos. When asked about her life in Singapore, she gave vague answers. How could a woman with no serious family conflict suddenly cut all communication? The warning signs multiplied. Her passport was missing, and immigration records showed no departure from the country. The more the family investigated, the more inconsistencies they found in Joanna's story. Months became years. Eventually, on September 7, 2018, 2 years after Evelyn disappeared, her son John Michael reported her missing. At first, police were not alarmed. Adults often leave voluntarily, they believed. There was no urgency, and the case remained low priority. Everything changed in June 2020, when renovation work was being done at Evelyn's house. One afternoon, Michael noticed a strong, foul odor coming from beneath the kitchen area. At first, he dismissed it, but the smell grew worse. Finally, he asked workers to dig. Beneath the concrete layer, they found Evelyn's ID card, passport, and bank card hidden inside the flooring. Fear replaced hope. Michael no longer believed his mother was in Singapore, yet he was terrified to dig any deeper. The next morning, he called the police. Officers arrived and were ready to investigate. Workers continued excavating. Hours later, they reached the top of the unfinished septic tank. When the cover was removed, a thick wave of stench filled the room. Inside lay a body, badly decomposed, almost unrecognizable. The area was immediately sealed off, and paramedics were called to recover the remains. The discovery stunned Michael and investigators. Buck! The body was transferred to the regional forensic laboratory. The autopsy results were devastating. The body belongs to Maria Evelyn Sayos. The examination confirmed homicide. Her body bore multiple stab injuries. Her skull had been fractured by a heavy object. There were 5 stab wounds to the chest, 2 to the neck, and defensive cuts on her right forearm. It was clear the killer acted with rage, likely hatred. Michael's worst fears were no longer speculation. His mother had been murdered, but he needed answers. Who had done it and why? The case that had puzzled the family for 4 years finally made sense. The woman everyone believed was living in Singapore was actually long dead, buried under her kitchen floor. Suspicion immediately focused on the 2 people who had insisted Evelyn was abroad, Joanna and her boyfriend, Ronald James Ruby. On July 23, 2020, police arrested Joanna and Ronald on suspicion of murder. During interrogation, investigators questioned them about Evelyn's disappearance. Both had lived in the house throughout the time she supposedly went to Singapore. Now, their behavior was tense, nervous. Silence filled the room until Joanna broke down. She confessed in tears she had killed her own mother and Ruby had helped her. The motive behind the killing was rooted in long-standing conflict. According to investigators, Ruby resented Evelyn deeply. He and Joanna were often criticized for their lifestyle. Evelyn, a strict, outspoken mother, frequently clashed with her daughter about responsibilities at home and how she was raising her child. The constant fighting created a toxic atmosphere. According to the suspects, anger and frustration grew until it exploded into violence. Evelyn, known as a caring mother from Dasmariñas, Cavite, devoted her life to her 2 children. Like many Filipino mothers, she combined affection with discipline. She wanted her children to succeed, especially her daughter. When Joanna became pregnant at 16 and moved in with her boyfriend, Evelyn felt heartbroken that her daughter was throwing away her education and future. According to Evelyn's son, she often scolded Joanna for neglecting her responsibilities as a young mother. She meant well, but her tough love only made Joanna more resentful. Whenever Evelyn scolded her, Joanna would run to Ruby and complain bitterly. Over time, Ruby became angry as well. He likely saw Evelyn as a barrier, a constant source of conflict. Eventually, the resentment hardened into a sinister plan. On the day Evelyn disappeared, Joanna called her mother downstairs, telling her she had a surprise. Unsuspecting, Evelyn walked down. At the bottom of the stairs, Ruby was waiting with a hammer in his hand, consumed by rage. He struck her on her head. Evelyn collapsed to the floor, groaning in pain. There was blood everywhere, but she was still alive. Panicked and realizing the situation had gone too far, Ruby shouted for Joanna to bring a kitchen knife. Joanna obeyed. Together, they inflicted multiple stab wounds, determined to make sure Evelyn would not survive. When the attack was over, they carried Evelyn's body to the unfinished septic tank beneath the house. They threw her into the murky water and believed they had erased their crime. Ruby then added gravel, sand, cement, mixed it himself, and sealed the tank. They were convinced no one would ever find out. But decomposition has a smell that cannot be silenced. As days turned into weeks, the odor of the body grew stronger. Neighbors noticed the stench coming from the house. Ruby was frequently seen mixing more cement, trying to seal cracks. Each time the smell returned, he would add another layer of concrete, desperate to hide what lay beneath. Meanwhile, Joanna created a second deception. She took control of Evelyn's online identity, posing as her mother on social media. She posted birthday greetings, replied to relatives, maintained the illusion that Evelyn was alive and well in Singapore. For years, this trick worked. Friends, family saw the posts and believed nothing was wrong. No one questioned Evelyn's absence until Michael discovered the documents buried under the floor. From that moment, the lies began to crumble. The truth finally emerged. Ruby was charged under Article 248, while Joanna was charged with murder under Article 246, a crime marked by extraordinary cruelty. At the moment, No public information is available regarding the final verdict for Joanna Marie Sayos and Ronald James Ruby concerning the murder of Maria Evelyn Sayos. According to the latest reports, both were arrested, formally charged, and remain in custody. It appears the trial either has not been concluded or has not been covered by the media. After the Sayos case shook the Philippines, another disturbing story from a different country illustrates how evil can hide behind ordinary walls. This case unfolded in Bogota, Colombia, made headlines in 1998. Local newspapers and television broadcasts reported that authorities had arrested a witch. The so-called witch turned out to be a con artist, a woman who claimed to practice magical arts promising healing, prosperity, and protection. In reality, her spells, potions, rituals existed for one purpose only: to deceive people and steal their money. Her real name was Maria Concepcion Ladino. She was better known as Doña Conchita or La Hermana Maria. Born in the 1960s in Bogota, she is said to have been fascinated with black magic and occult practices from a young age. One morning, while waiting for a food truck, Maria got into a fight with another woman. Both had fiery tempers, and the argument quickly turned physical. Realizing she was losing, Maria suddenly stepped back, waved her arms strangely, began muttering incomprehensible words. Bystanders could not understand what she was saying, but the scene was unsettling. Within days, rumors spread through the neighborhood. When her rival was hospitalized shortly afterward with severe bone pain, neighbors whispered that Maria had cursed her. Maria was soon branded a witch. Surprisingly, Maria did not fear the title. She embraced it. If anything, she saw an opportunity. People now believed she possessed real powers. Soon, they began seeking her help. Very little was known about Maria's personal life. She rarely spoke about herself. Neighbors only knew she had no husband, no children, no family. She rented a room in a large house owned by an elderly couple, Eduardo, a retired man, and his wife Nubia. Eduardo spent most of his time in front of the house solving crossword puzzles. Nubia could usually be found near the local school, selling papas corridas, a popular Colombian dish. Maria quickly earned their trust. Seeing them struggling with their daily chores, she offered to help, shopping, cleaning the house. She, promising to heal their aches and pains with a secret aromatherapy oil and herbal massage. The couple was grateful. Slowly, Maria became indispensable to them. Then, one day, the elderly couple simply disappeared. At first, no one was alarmed. Life in the neighborhood went on. A few people noticed that Nubia had stopped selling her food. When neighbors asked Maria where Eduardo and Nubia had gone, she said they were sick or that they had moved to live with their children. No one questioned her further. Maria's appearance had improved significantly. She dressed better, looked well-groomed, and seemed much healthier. A few months after the elderly couple disappeared, their children from Ibagué visited because they hadn't heard from their parents in a while. They found the house locked and Maria absent. Concerned, they contacted the police, who forced the door open. Inside, everything appeared normal. A missing person report was filed. The investigation revealed that a large amount of cash, about 15 million Colombian pesos, was missing from Eduardo's home. Months later, children playing near the San Juan River discovered a body beneath a pile of stones. It was Eduardo. His corpse showed multiple injuries indicating a violent death. Despite an investigation, the perpetrator could not be identified. Nubia, his wife, was never found. On August 15, 1994, Maria quietly moved to Fontibon, a lively suburb west of Bogota. Once again, she began searching for a room to rent. She eventually found lodging in the home of 54-year-old Carlos Montaña, who lived with his wife and 3 small children. Immediately, Maria began using the same strategy she had used before. She told Carlos he looked exhausted and offered her healing skills, claiming she had remedies given by forces from the other side. She produced a mysterious substance from her bag. Carlos took it, more out of politeness than belief. Over the next weeks, Carlos began trusting Maria. He took the potion she provided, and he truly felt better. Soon, he was doing everything she instructed. He bathed in herbal mixtures to drive out evil spirits, took part in ritual sessions, obeyed her spiritual advice. To the family, they began believing Maria truly possessed some gift. But in October of that same year, everything changed. Carlos's wife returned from work, noticed he hadn't eaten the food she had prepared. She went to the bedroom and found her husband asleep. Moments later, Maria entered, told her not to wake him. He was in a spiritual trance. She led Carlos's wife and children downstairs for a seance to guide his soul. During this seance, the wife felt a chill run down her spine. Anxiety rising, she hurried back upstairs. There, she found Carlos lying in a pool of blood. She noticed a deep wound at his throat. Horrified, she called an ambulance and the police. Police arrived within minutes and questioned Maria and the widow, but neither provided clear answers. Investigators soon learned that Carlos had been poisoned. Then his throat had been cut. In the following days, the widow received handwritten letters, supposedly written by Carlos from beyond the grave. The letters urged the family to trust Maria, claiming only she could help him find peace in the afterlife, that all belongings should be given to her. This time, the widow did not believe the trick. She threatened to report Maria to the police. The next morning, Maria disappeared. She resurfaced in San Cristobal, where she rented another room. Soon she met Adalberto Guevara, a taxi owner with 2 vehicles. He confided that he was struggling financially and believed he was cursed. Maria confirmed his fears and offered to cleanse him from evil spirits for 1 million pesos. She subjected Adalberto to several herbal baths, just as she had with others before him. But her ritual was only beginning. After several weeks, Adalberto realized that the cleansing rituals had done nothing to improve his situation. In fact, his finances were getting worse. Desperate, he decided to sell his taxis and placed an advertisement. Maria learned of this quickly. She told him she had a son who would gladly buy the vehicles and advised him to withdraw the advertisement. Shortly afterward, a purchase agreement was signed. Maria paid using a check. She then convinced Adalberto to undergo one final cleansing ceremony, promising that it would protect him from all evil, no matter what happened. After that, Adalberto was never seen alive again. When his family went to the bank to cash the check, they were told it came from a stolen checkbook and was invalid. Alarmed, the family began searching for Maria, certain she was responsible. A week later, they received letters from beyond the grave, written in Adalberto's name. They contacted the police. Maria was arrested and charged with fraud, but she was eventually released due to lack of evidence. After her release, she returned the cars and moved away. This time, she settled in Bucaramanga, where she became known as Sister Maria. In August 1996, she resumed her activities. Her next victim was an elderly woman named Heidi Forero, a jewelry seller. Maria used her familiar method, convincing Heidi that her business needed a blessing ritual to prosper. The ritual took place in Heidi's shop. Maria spoke in a made-up language and handed her a glass containing a green liquid. Moments later, Heidi collapsed. Maria searched the store, stealing jewelry. Before leaving, she took Heidi's car keys, placed the unconscious woman in the vehicle, drove several kilometers to a secluded area, poured gasoline she had purchased earlier, and set the car on fire. Heidi's body was discovered the next day. Maria had already vanished. Maria returned to Bogotá and befriended a woman who kept 3 million pesos hidden at home. Maria manipulated the woman, offering her the magic potion. This time, it only rendered the victim unconscious for a few hours. While she slept, Maria took the money and left, believing the woman was dead. In 1997, Maria settled in the San Cristobal district, north of Bogotá, where she once again managed to steal a large sum from an elderly couple before murdering them. Till then, she defrauded more than 20 people. Some victims disappeared entirely, while others, terrified of her supposed powers, preferred not to report her to the authorities. In early April 1997, the 3 sisters of Belo Clavijo approached Maria for help. Their mother was in the final stage of cancer. The grieving daughters hoped Maria might somehow save her. Maria agreed. She visited their home multiple times, performing her bogus rituals. In the process, she learned that the dying woman had saved 13 million British pounds, which would go to her daughters upon her death. The mother died a month later. Maria claimed she had done everything possible and then comforted the grieving daughters. A week later, when they received their inheritance, Maria convinced them that the money needed to be blessed. She promised that through a special ritual, the inheritance could even be doubled within 4 months. In the following months, the sisters received the now familiar letters from beyond, supposedly written by their mother, urging them to trust Maria completely because Maria would protect them. In mid-July 1997, Maria met the 3 sisters to begin the ritual. She instructed them to bring the money and place it in a wooden chest, which was then slid under the bed. Once done, Maria began to summon spirits to cleanse it of negative energy. The sisters held hands. Maria acted as a medium, allowing them to speak with their deceased mother through her. After some time, the sisters attended another seance to communicate with their mother, but during the ritual, one of them began to sense that something was wrong. She quietly went to the room where the chest was kept. When she opened it, she was shocked to discover that it contained only 4 banknotes. When her 3 sisters found out, a heated argument broke out. Maria tried to calm them, insisting that the money was still there, only invisible to ordinary eyes. She assured them that if they remained patient and trusted her, they would receive double the amount they had placed in the chest. As the final step, Maria said, the sisters needed to undergo a purification ritual. The ritual, she explained, had to take place by water. So Maria led the 3 sisters to a stream outside the city. There, she handed them a potion and instructed them to drink. They obeyed without question. Moments later, one after another, they collapsed into unconsciousness. Maria then lifted several heavy stones, hit them on the heads. She covered their bodies with branches and stones, then walked away from the creek. 5 days later, the 3 sisters' relatives reported the disappearance of them to the police. During the investigation, authorities discovered that a woman named Maria had recently been involved with them. Within days, they located the address of the room she had rented, but when the police entered, she was already gone. Veteran investigators were convinced this was not her first crime. They began reviewing unsolved cases from the past. Soon found an unsolved case from 1994 involving so-called witchcraft and healing rituals. More cases followed, all linked by rumors of a wandering witch targeting vulnerable victims. Police began searching for a woman between 40 and 45 years old, believed to be involved in occult practices and constantly moving from place to place. On August 10, 1998, the bodies of 3 women were discovered near a creek in Bogotá. They were badly decomposed, but within hours, they were identified as the missing sisters. Autopsies revealed traces of benzodiazepines in their systems, the same substance found in several earlier cases. At the scene, a detective noticed a surveillance camera positioned near the creek entrance. He requested the footage from the day of the disappearance. The video revealed the license plate of the vehicle carrying Maria. On August 17, 1998, police organized an operation to locate and arrest Maria Concepcion Ladino, the prime suspect in a string of disappearances, murders, and frauds. The next morning, around 1 a.m. on August 17, officers spotted her traveling in a taxi. A pursuit began. When the taxi stopped, Maria jumped out and tried to run, but she was quickly captured. She claimed she had no idea why she was being arrested. During interrogation, she laughed, insulted officers. She behaved erratically, apparently attempting to feign madness. Investigators, however, saw through her performance. They were now certain they had arrested a calculating, cold manipulator. Maria was transferred to El Buen Pastor Women's Prison in Bogotá and underwent psychiatric evaluation. After several tests, she was found fully responsible for her actions and diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. In 1999, Maria Concepcion Ladino was tried. She was convicted of killing 6 people, including 3 sisters, and defrauding more than 20 people. She sentenced to 40 years and several months in prison. After serving more than 2 decades in El Buen Pastor Prison in Bogotá, Maria Concepcion Ladino was granted conditional release in 2019 thanks to her age, declining health, the good grades she accumulated during her sentence, which reduced her sentence from 40 years to about 30 years in reality, according to Colombian law. Since then, she has lived in seclusion on the outskirts of Bogota, away from public and media attention, with her exact whereabouts not publicly disclosed due to victim protection and personal security measures. As of 2025, there is no new information about her activities, but investigators are still keeping a close watch to prevent any recurrence, while the local community still refers to La Hermana Maria as a warning about the scammers lurking in the shadows. Love is often viewed as a beautiful and gentle emotion, connected to life's most cherished moments. But when love loses its balance, it can become incredibly dangerous. When control replaces concern, when jealousy overrides reason, emotions can turn into obsession, and in the darkest cases, into an unforgivable crime. The story of Maritza, Emilio, and their daughter Joandra is not just the tragedy of a broken family. It is a series of wrong choices spanning years, pain fueled by hatred, obsession. Above all, it serves as a terrifying warning that the past, if not let go of, can return to destroy the present. To understand why this tragedy happened, we need to go back in time to where it all began. In the late 1970s, Cuba was experiencing a period of severe socioeconomic hardship. Daily life was marked by shortages, restrictions, and uncertainty. It was during this challenging period of history that Maritza and Emilio met. They immediately felt a mutual attraction. Emilio fell deeply in love with Maritza, believing she was the one he had been searching for. However, his family worried about their relationship. They were both very young, and their future together seemed unstable. Like many young couples, their strong feelings for each other led them to move quickly without thinking things through carefully. Their daughter, Joandra Núñez, was born on May 29, 1977. Afterward, motherhood became Maritza's main focus. She dedicated herself completely to their daughter. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming in the marriage. By 1978, barely a year after the wedding, Maritza began confiding in her parents about serious problems in her relationship. The household was tense, arguments were frequent, and the situation deteriorated further after Joandra's birth. Emilio loved his daughter deeply, but his idea of fatherhood was rigid, controlling. He distrusted Maritza's ability to raise their child and became increasingly possessive. Maritza, in turn, grew alarmed by his jealousy, aggressive behavior. Emilio, however, blamed their struggles not on himself, but on the oppressive political, social, and economic environment in Cuba. Eventually, Emilio began talking about escaping the country. He confided in a friend he trusted. That trust was misplaced. The friend reported him to the authorities. Emilio was arrested and classified as a political prisoner. He faced a sentence of up to 20 years in a Cuban prison for attempting to flee the country. Despite everything, Maritza and Emilio did not immediately separate. There were still feelings between them. The prison walls created an insurmountable distance. Emilio was cut off from his wife and from his daughter's life. During his incarceration, he was subjected to psychiatric treatment, including electroshock therapy, procedures he later described as degrading, traumatic. By 1980, Joandra was nearly 3 years old and Cuba was on the brink of massive change. That year marked the beginning of the Mariel boat lift, a mass exodus in which more than 125,000 Cubans fled to the United States, most heading to Florida. For many, it represented escape, survival, and the promise of a new life. Maritza was among those who left. She managed to reach Miami but was forced to leave Joandra behind in Cuba, under the care of her grandmother. Determined to reunite her family, Maritza worked tirelessly, saving money and navigating the complex immigration system, hoping one day to bring her daughter and mother to the United States legally. For nearly 9 years, Maritza rebuilt her life in America. In 1989, she remarried. Her new husband, Armando Martin, provided stability and support. Together, they had a son. The marriage also made it possible for Maritza to finally bring her loved ones, most importantly, Joandra, to the United States. For the first time in years, mother and daughter were reunited. Life seemed to be moving in a hopeful direction. That same year marked a turning point for Emilio as well. As part of broader political changes, he was released, granted the opportunity to seek asylum in the United States. He dreamed of starting his life over. But by then, Maritza had built a new life, and Emilio struggled to re-establish contact with her or with Yoandra. Before leaving Cuba, Emilio remarried, began rebuilding his life. Eventually, he traveled to the United States with his new wife and her son. Ironically, shortly after arriving in Miami, Emilio coincidentally met Maritza and Yoandra. Yoandra, now around 10 years old, did not recognize him. To her, he was a stranger. Emilio longed to embrace his daughter, but the child was visibly frightened. For Emilio, that moment was devastating, a painful reminder of all that he had lost and could never get back. Emilio had no choice but to keep moving forward, adapting to life in a new country, while clinging to the hope that one day he could repair his relationship with his daughter. He and his newlywed wife moved into a mobile home on a farm, where Emilio worked as a caretaker and property manager to make a living. The family struggled financially and barely made ends meet, but Emilio refused to return to Cuba under any circumstances. Despite the cramped living conditions, Emilio always kept a separate room prepared for his daughter, just in case she ever chose to live with him. He often admitted that Yoandra occupied a special, irreplaceable place in his heart. He thought about her constantly, replaying memories and wondering how her life was unfolding without him. Emilio longed to reconnect with his child, but Maritza firmly opposed the idea of her daughter having a close relationship with her biological father. At that time, Yoandra lived with her mother and stepfather in the Miami area, near North Lauderdale. By the time she completed elementary school, Yoandra was considered one of the brightest students in her class. She was cheerful, sociable, quick-witted, and academically gifted. However, everything began to change once Yoandra entered her teenage years. After transferring to Oakland Park Middle School, her behavior shifted noticeably. Her grades declined, she began skipping classes, and she grew increasingly withdrawn. When friends asked what was wrong, she hinted that things at home had become difficult. At first, her family attributed the changes to the stress of adjusting to a new school, but over time, the situation worsened. There were no reports of conflicts with classmates, yet Yoandra seemed emotionally distant. At the age of 15, she began dating a boy named Angel. In November 1992, Yoandra discovered she was pregnant. Terrified and unsure what to do, she eventually told her mother. Maritza's reaction was harsh. Rumors later circulated that Maritza had physically struck her daughter. Some people believe she used a belt to punish Yoandra. These allegations were never officially confirmed, and no domestic violence reports were filed. Yoandra herself never spoke publicly about abuse. Still, her friends believed that tension and poor communication at home were at the root of her emotional decline. Yoandra reassured those closest to her that everything would soon return to normal. On the evening of Wednesday, November 25, 1992, Yoandra unexpectedly offered to wash her parents' car, an unusual gesture that stood out. However, with Thanksgiving approaching the next morning, her family didn't give it much thought. Maritza and her husband assumed Yoandra was simply trying to be helpful or make peace. The following morning, the household stirred awake, except for Yoandra. She remained in her bedroom long after everyone else was up. After several hours passed, her continued silence became alarming. Maritza and her husband went to check on her. When they entered the room, they found Yoandra lying on her back in bed, her eyes open, completely unresponsive. Panic set in instantly. Maritza called emergency services, but when paramedics arrived, there was nothing they could do. Yoandra was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation determined that Yoandra had died from a gunshot wound to the chest. She'd used a .25 caliber pistol that belonged to her mother. The firearm was typically kept in the trunk of Maritza's car for self-defense. Investigators soon realized the significance of Yoandra's offer to wash the car the night before. It had been a way to access the weapon. Initially, detectives examined the possibility of foul play involving family members. However, forensic evidence ruled that out. Gunshot residue was found on Yoandra's hands, and her fingerprints were present on the weapon. A suicide note was also recovered. The medical examiner concluded that Yoandra Núñez had taken her own life. Although Maritza and her husband remained under scrutiny for a short period due to standard investigative procedures, no evidence supported claims of violence or coercion. Ultimately, both were cleared, and the case was officially closed. Yoandra's death devastated her family. The loss was incomprehensible. 3 days after Yoandra's death, Emilio received a phone call from a friend. It was only then, barely an hour before the funeral, that he learned of his daughter's tragic fate. The news sent him into a state of uncontrollable rage. He immediately accused Yoandra's mother and stepfather of deliberately hiding her death from him, robbing him of the chance to say goodbye. Emilio abandoned everything and rushed to the funeral, but instead of grieving quietly, he began aggressively questioning everyone in attendance. He was convinced that Maritza had played a direct role in pushing their daughter toward end her life. His anger intensified when he learned that Yoandra had been 13 weeks pregnant, that her mother had allegedly scolded her repeatedly instead of offering comfort or support. Even during the funeral itself, Emilio openly threatened his ex-wife and her family. His behavior was considered alarming. Still, most people attributed his outbursts to overwhelming grief and emotional collapse. Law enforcement officers were present at the service, and Emilio approached them, hoping to uncover what he believed was the real cause of his daughter's death. When officers refused to share details or confirm his suspicions, Emilio became convinced that authorities were conspiring with Maritza to cover up the truth. In his mind, Yoandra would never have taken her own life willingly. He was certain she had been driven to it, or worse, murdered. From that point forward, Emilio began stalking Maritza. He confronted her in grocery stores and public places, accusing her repeatedly of killing their daughter. His version of events grew increasingly erratic. At one point, he suggested that Yoandra's stepfather might have been the father of her unborn child, implying abuse. Emilio ignored the fact that Yoandra had left a suicide note identifying her boyfriend as the father. Emilio became convinced that Maritza had psychologically destroyed Yoandra and manipulated her into ending her life. He criticized the official investigation, calling it superficial and prejudiced. He accused the detectives of not caring about immigrant families. Those close to Maritza believed the accusations were baseless. She was devastated by her daughter's death, sank into profound grief. Eventually, she sold the family home, unable to bear the pain of walking past Yoandra's bedroom. Even after moving, Maritza would sometimes return to the neighborhood, sitting in her car near the house for long stretches, staring silently and crying, her own way of coping with unbearable loss. Another reason for the move was Emilio's escalating harassment. His relentless threats, visible rage, made Maritza and her husband fear for their young son's safety. They ultimately relocated to another part of Florida to stay with relatives. Maritza sought help from police and requested a restraining order against Emilio. Instead of granting it, officers discouraged her, warning that such an order might only provoke him further. Effectively, her request was denied. Nearly 2 months after Yoandra's death, Emilio still could not locate Maritza and refused to let go of his obsession. Convinced that the person responsible for his daughter's death was walking free, he decided to seek public attention. In January 1993, he contacted a local news station, shared his version of events, accusing Yoandra's mother and stepfather of driving her to end her life. His story caught the attention of journalist Ingrid Cruz, who saw a compelling human interest angle. She and a cameraman agreed to visit Emilio's mobile home on January 18th. Once the camera was rolling, Emilio recounted his story with intense emotion, vivid detail. His pain appeared raw, and the journalists found themselves moved by his anguish. After the interview, Ingrid and the cameraman suggested filming Emilio at Yoandra's grave as a closing scene. Emilio agreed without hesitation. Before heading to the cemetery, however, the journalists also decided to speak with Yoandra's boyfriend. He agreed to be interviewed and shared information that added new layers to the story. He revealed that Yoandra had, at times, spoken about wanting to end her life. He also believed that Maritza's harsh treatment had deeply affected her emotional state. He recalled Yuandra expressing a desire to leave her mother's home and return to live with her father, words that, in hindsight, took on a haunting significance. After the interview with Yuandra's boyfriend ended, Ingrid and the cameraman headed to the cemetery, where Emilio was already present with his wife and child. He visited his daughter's grave every single day, leaving fresh flowers and remaining there quietly for about half an hour. But this visit would unfold very differently. As filming began, a car slowly passed by. By sheer coincidence, Maritza had also come to the cemetery that day to pay her respects to their daughter. While Emilio stood near the grave, Ingrid and the cameraman approached Maritza's vehicle. Ingrid knocked on the window and began asking questions. After placing flowers at the grave, Emilio noticed what was happening and rushed toward the car, shouting angrily at Maritza. Ingrid attempted to calm him, hoping to preserve the interview and de-escalate the situation, but emotions quickly spiraled out of control. Maritza did not respond. She remained silent and stayed in the car. Emilio suddenly turned away, walked back to his car, began searching for something inside. Moments later, Maritza stepped out of her vehicle, walked toward her daughter's grave. Ingrid followed her, continuing to ask questions. Emilio trailed behind them, shouting accusations, calling Maritza a traitor, blaming her for their daughter's death, and hurling insults. Maritza did not answer. She remained silent as she approached the grave. What? Suddenly, Emilio pulled out a handgun, shot Maritza in the back of the head. The shooting occurred directly in front of the journalists, and the entire act was captured on camera. Even after Maritza collapsed to the ground, Emilio's rage did not subside. He continued firing. In total, he discharged 12 rounds, 10 of which struck Maritza in the head, neck, chest, and back. When later asked why he had done it, Emilio showed no remorse. He calmly stated that killing Maritza might have saved his daughter's life. He then returned to his car and fled the scene. Ingrid was left in shock, frozen by what she had just witnessed. The cameraman, however, managed to remain composed and immediately called emergency services. Police arrived quickly, interviewed witnesses, secured the scene, launched a search for Emilio. His vehicle was soon discovered abandoned on the outskirts of the city. Emilio was gone, and so was the weapon. The murder of Maritza, following so closely after her daughter's death, became national news. Emilio was now a fugitive, considered armed and extremely dangerous. A massive manhunt began. Eventually, FBI agents received a tip that a man matching Emilio's description was traveling on a bus bound for Los Angeles. Authorities intercepted the bus in Texas. The bus was full of passengers. When Emilio realized law enforcement was approaching, he drew his weapon. Panic erupted, and passengers fled the bus. Fortunately, no one else was harmed. Emilio, then 34 years old, was quickly subdued and taken into custody. He was transported to the Midland County Detention Center. Footage of Maritza's final moments circulated across the world. Many media outlets have reported on this story as that of a distraught father seeking revenge on his ex-wife, whom he believes is the reason his daughter took her own life and for preventing him from being involved in her life. However, those familiar with the family's history strongly disagreed. They argued that what the cameras truly captured was not revenge, but a brutal act of domestic violence rooted in obsession and control. This narrative deeply angered Maritza's husband, Armando, who worked tirelessly to clear his late wife's name. Armando described Emilio not as a devoted father, but as a stalker. After his release from prison, Emilio began relentlessly harassing Maritza, who was simply trying to move on with her life. Armando detailed numerous incidents that painted Emilio as unstable and dangerous. He emphasized that Maritza had sought legal protection, but her request for a restraining order had been denied, an omission that would later prove fatal. Armando firmly denied all allegations that Maritza had ever physically abused Yuandra. He rejected claims that she had slapped her daughter upon learning of the pregnancy, calling them outright fabrications invented by a man desperate to justify his obsession. According to Armando, Maritza did scold her daughter at times, especially when overwhelmed or confused, but she never resorted to violence. Most chilling of all, Armando revealed that Maritza had lived in constant fear of Emilio. So convinced was she that he would eventually kill her, especially after the restraining order was denied. That fear, tragically, was not misplaced. After his arrest, Emilio initially refused to cooperate with law enforcement or speak to journalists. For nearly a month, he maintained complete silence. Eventually, however, he agreed to speak publicly, largely repeating the same version of events he had told from the beginning. Around this time, both Maritza's parents and Emilio's parents entered the public discussion. Members of both families described Emilio as a volatile and aggressive man. According to relatives, during his first marriage in Cuba, he had repeatedly threatened to kill his wife. Several family members from both sides believed Emilio suffered from serious mental health problems. This view was indirectly supported even by his own parents, who admitted that their son had long struggled with emotional instability. Emilio's father recalled that while living in Havana, Emilio had been considered a below-average student and was forced to repeat the 4th grade. By the age of 16, his behavioral problems had noticeably intensified, though the family declined to provide specific details. Maritza's husband, Armando, later stated that his wife had initially wanted to preserve a peaceful relationship between Emilio and their daughter, even after relocating to the United States. However, Emilio's uncontrollable temper and unprovoked aggression made this impossible. Eventually, Maritza abandoned any hope of reconciliation, believing that continued contact posed a serious danger. As public debate intensified, Maritza was laid to rest beside her daughter, her grave located only a few steps from the spot where Emilio had murdered her. As additional information about Emilio's past came to light, many began to suspect that he had suffered from untreated mental illness for much of his life. Those issues were believed to have worsened during his incarceration in Cuba, regardless of any psychiatric treatment he may have received. Nevertheless, the public overwhelmingly wanted justice. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for January 1993, but the case was repeatedly delayed. It was not until January 19, 2000, nearly 7 years later, that a jury was finally seated. Throughout those years, Emilio Núñez's defense attorneys employed extensive delaying tactics. They repeatedly sought to have him declared legally insane, filed numerous motions, and demanded additional psychiatric evaluations, significantly prolonging the process. Emilio himself proved difficult to work with. He dismissed several attorneys, refusing to follow their legal advice. Although an insanity defense appeared to be the most logical strategy given his mental health history, Emilio rejected it outright. He insisted on maintaining his narrative and portraying himself as a wronged father driven by grief. Tensions between Emilio and his legal team escalated to such an extent that he reportedly spat on one of his attorneys, prompting the lawyer to withdraw from the case. Over time, the murder of Maritza Martin became the oldest unresolved homicide case in the county, remaining in legal limbo for nearly 7 years. When the trial finally began, Emilio continued to claim that he'd been overwhelmed by grief and mistreated by authorities. One of the first people targeted by his accusations was journalist Ingrid Cruz. Emilio alleged that she had exploited him for a sensational story, claiming he had been emotionally vulnerable and manipulated. His attorneys echoed this argument, portraying Ingrid as someone who deliberately asked provocative questions to incite his emotional breakdown. The defense even suggested that Ingrid had somehow orchestrated events so that Maritza and Emilio would be present at the cemetery simultaneously. However, no evidence supported these claims. Investigators concluded that the encounter was nothing more than a tragic coincidence. The trial lasted nearly a week. Despite the defense's attempts to shift blame onto the media, the evidence against Emilio was overwhelming. When the jury retired to deliberate, they returned with a guilty verdict in just 40 minutes. At sentencing, Emilio Núñez was given life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. As he was escorted from the courtroom, he held up a handwritten sign declaring that he had not received a fair trial and told jurors that he would one day return to tell the real truth. Every appeal he later filed was denied. The call came just after midnight, December 9, 2001. A man's voice, full of tension. He tells the dispatcher his wife has fallen down the stairs. She is still breathing, he says at first. Then, moments later, she is not. Police arrive at the Peterson residence on Cedar Street in Durham, North Carolina. What they encounter does not resemble a simple accident. Kathleen Peterson lies at the base of a narrow staircase. Her body is surrounded by blood, thick, dark, pooled across the hardwood floor and smeared along the walls. Blood spatter reaches higher than expected. Too high, according to later analysis, for a fall alone? The timeline is unclear from the start. Emergency responders note that Kathleen's blood appears partially dried. This suggests she may have been there longer than Michael initially indicated. According to the autopsy results, she had multiple lacerations on the back of her head, some estimated to be as many as 7, but no skull fracture, which is common in cases of fatal falls downstairs. Michael Peterson was standing nearby. He was barefoot and appeared calm, according to some officers who would later give statements. Others recalled something different. He appeared indifferent, almost as if he had been prepared for it. According to the initial report, he claims they had been outside by the pool earlier that evening. Kathleen had gone inside ahead of him. He says he found her after a few minutes, or maybe longer. There are no signs of forced entry, no immediate evidence of an intruder. The home is quiet, undisturbed. Investigators begin to consider the most immediate possibility, someone inside the house. Kathleen Peterson was a successful and well-respected executive at Nortel Networks. Those who knew her described her as driven, organized, pragmatic, and cautious. They believed she was not careless and would not have fallen without a clear reason. As the night goes on, the situation becomes more complicated. The amount of blood, the types of injuries, and the conflicting timelines don't add up. What first looked like a sad accident is slowly, but clearly, starting to seem like something suspicious. And at the center of it all stands Michael Peterson, husband, witness, possibly more. By morning, the question is no longer just what happened on those stairs, but whether it was ever an accident at all. Before the blood, before the staircase, Michael Peterson was a man accustomed to narrative control. He was, by public record, a novelist, a columnist, a former Marine who had served in Vietnam, though aspects of his military record would later be disputed. In Durham, he was known as an outspoken political voice, sharp, articulate, and often critical of local authority. In 1999, he had even run for mayor. He lost, but not without drawing attention. To neighbors and acquaintances, the Peterson household appeared stable, affluent, blended. Michael and Kathleen had been married for over a decade. Together, they raised a complex family that included biological children and 2 daughters. Michael had adopted after the death of a close family friend, Elizabeth Ratliff. Kathleen was the primary financial provider. Records later presented in court showed she earned a substantial income from her executive role at Nortel Networks. Michael, by contrast, had not published a novel in years. His income was limited, reportedly supplemented by Kathleen's success. On the surface, their marriage appeared functional, even affectionate. Friends described shared dinners, social gatherings, and a sense of partnership. But as investigators began to look closer, fractures started to emerge. According to emails recovered during the investigation, Michael had been engaging in secret online communications with male escorts. These exchanges, explicit in nature, were unknown to Kathleen, at least according to the prosecution's theory. There was no confirmed evidence that she had discovered them that night, but investigators began to consider whether a confrontation could have taken place. Financial records also painted a more complicated picture. Nortel, Kathleen's employer, was reportedly facing instability at the time. According to court testimony, her job security may have been uncertain. The Peterson household, despite its appearance, carried significant debt. The image of domestic harmony began to shift, not collapse, but strain. Michael himself remained consistent in his account. He maintained that Kathleen's death was a tragic accident, that there had been no argument, no violence, no motive. Yet investigators could not ignore the contradictions forming around him. A man skilled in storytelling, a household under pressure, a private life concealed behind a carefully managed public image. And as detectives continued to reconstruct the final hours of Kathleen Peterson's life, one question began to take shape with increasing urgency. Was Michael Peterson simply a husband who found his wife too late, or a man who had already decided how the story would end? The staircase was central to the case. It was a narrow, wooden, winding staircase at the back of the house. It didn't seem like a place where someone would have a fatal fall. However, Michael Peterson claimed that Kathleen had slipped on these stairs alone at night and died from her injuries. Investigators returned to the scene with increasing scrutiny. What they saw did not settle into a simple narrative. Blood marked the walls in elongated streaks. There were patterns, fine droplets, and larger smears that extended upward, inconsistent, according to later expert testimony, with a single backward fall. Some analysts described the presence of what appeared to be cast-off patterns, often associated with repeated impacts. Others, including defense experts, would later argue that those patterns could result from coughing or exhalation during prolonged bleeding. The volume of blood was significant, more than what first responders expected from a fall. According to the autopsy results performed by the North Carolina medical examiner, Kathleen Peterson had multiple deep lacerations on her scalp, but no corresponding skull fracture. There were also injuries to her face and neck. Notably absent were defensive wounds on her hands or arms, though interpretations of this detail varied. The absence of a skull fracture became a point of contention. Prosecutors argued that the lacerations were consistent with blunt force trauma from an object. The defense countered that the injuries could occur if a person repeatedly struck their head against a hard surface during a fall. Time added another layer of uncertainty. Kathleen's blood had partially dried by the time emergency personnel arrived. According to investigative reports, this suggested a longer interval between injury and the 911 call than initially implied. Michael Peterson stated he had been outside by the pool for an extended period. The exact duration, however, remained unclear. Footprints in blood were documented at the scene. Some appeared to match Michael's shoes. Investigators questioned whether he had moved through the area after Kathleen was injured. He stated he had attempted to help her. No murder weapon was recovered. No clear sign of forced assault beyond the injuries themselves. And yet, the scene resisted simplicity. Experts began to divide. Some saw evidence of a violent encounter. Others saw a tragic, chaotic fall misinterpreted through expectation. The staircase, silent and unchanged, held both possibilities at once. As forensic experts disagreed, the investigation faced a crucial decision. If the crime scene couldn't provide clear answers, they would need to investigate the victim's history and background. The investigation did not remain confined to Durham. As detectives worked to understand Kathleen Peterson's death, a detail from Michael Peterson's past resurfaced, quietly at first, then with growing weight. It was not new. It had simply not been connected. In 1985, in Germany, a woman named Elizabeth Ratliff was found dead at the bottom of a staircase. She had been a close friend of Michael Peterson and his first wife. At the time, her death was ruled natural, attributed to a cerebral hemorrhage, according to German authorities. There was no suspicion of foul play. Michael Peterson was among the last people known to have seen her alive. After her death, Peterson and his wife became guardians to Ratliff's 2 daughters. They raised them as their own. For years, the event remained in the past, unquestioned, officially resolved. But in 2001, after Kathleen's death, investigators began to draw comparisons. 2 women, 2 staircases. Both are found at the bottom, both with head injuries. Both are connected to Michael Peterson. The similarities were difficult to ignore. According to the investigation file, authorities in North Carolina sought to re-examine Ratliff's death. Her body was exhumed and transported to the United States for a second autopsy. The findings, presented by forensic pathologist Dr. Deborah Radish, differed sharply from the original German conclusion. She determined that Ratliff's injuries were consistent with homicide, specifically blunt force trauma. This conclusion was not universally accepted. Critics later argued that the reevaluation, conducted years after death, may have been influenced by the circumstances surrounding Kathleen Peterson's case. The original ruling of natural causes remained part of the historical record. Still, for prosecutors, the pattern was compelling. They introduced Ratliff's death as evidence of what they described as a signature, not proof of guilt on its own, but an indication of behavioral repetition. A prior incident, they argued, that mirrored the present case too closely to dismiss. For the defense, it was a dangerous leap. They maintained that the two deaths were unrelated. That coincidence, however unsettling, was not evidence of intent. But the narrative had shifted. The case was no longer just about a single night in Durham. It now carried the shadow of another death, another staircase, another unanswered question stretching back over a decade. And as the past weighed heavily on the present, investigators began to examine not only what had happened, but also the true character of Michael Peterson. As investigators pushed deeper, the case began to shift from the physical to the personal. What was once considered a stable, wealthy marriage now reveals layers of deception that had been subtly and deliberately concealed for years. The focus turned inward, toward Michael Peterson's private life, toward what Kathleen may or may not have known. During the forensic examination of Michael's computer, investigators discovered a series of emails and digital files. According to court records, these communications included explicit exchanges with male escorts. The messages suggested ongoing contact, not isolated incidents. Some were recent, close enough in time to raise questions about whether they overlapped with the final days of Kathleen's life. There was no definitive evidence that Kathleen had discovered these communications. No recorded confrontation, no witness to an argument that night. But for prosecutors, the possibility became central. They constructed a theory that Kathleen, described by friends as pragmatic and disciplined, would not have accepted such a revelation easily. That as she had discovered Michael's secret, it could have triggered a confrontation. The defense countered with a different portrait. What? They argued that Michael's bisexuality was not a secret within the marriage, that Kathleen was aware, or at least not unaware, that their relationship, while unconventional, was built on mutual understanding. This claim, however, remained contested and not fully substantiated by independent evidence. Financial pressure added another dimension. According to trial testimony, the Peterson household carried significant debt despite its outward appearance of stability. Kathleen's income supported much of the family's lifestyle. At the same time, Nortel Networks was reportedly undergoing financial decline. Her position, once secure, may have been at risk, though the extent of that risk was not conclusively established. Prosecutors suggested a convergence of motives: financial strain, fear of exposure, the potential collapse of both personal and economic stability. No single factor stood alone, but together they formed a framework. Even though motive suggests a reason, it doesn't prove guilt. It doesn't provide evidence like a weapon or recreate the crime. It simply offers a possible explanation for why the crime might have happened. And yet, as the prosecution continued to build its case, these hidden elements began to shape how the night on Cedar Street was understood, not as an isolated event, but as the breaking point of something long concealed. The investigation was no longer searching only for physical evidence. It was searching for intent. And soon, that search would move into the courtroom, where every detail, every contradiction, every private truth would be laid bare under oath. The courtroom in Durham became the stage where two versions of the same night would collide, each built on the same evidence yet leading to entirely different truths. Michael Peterson's trial began in 2003. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Jim Hardin, presented a case grounded in violence. They argued that Kathleen Peterson did not fall. She was beaten. The injuries to her head, the volume of blood, and the patterns on the staircase walls pointed not to an accident, but to repeated blows from a weapon. There was no murder weapon recovered, Instead, prosecutors suggested an object consistent with a blowpoke, a fireplace tool later found in the Peterson home. Though no definitive blood evidence tied it directly to the crime, they argued its shape and weight could explain the injuries. Central to the prosecution's case was bloodstain pattern analysis. Agent Dwayne Deaver of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation testified as an expert witness. He demonstrated how the blood patterns found on the walls in Michael Peterson's clothing were consistent, according to his analysis, with cast-off from a beating. He concluded that Michael was present during the infliction of the injuries. The defense challenged this immediately. A big isnack! They argued that Deaver's conclusions were flawed. The patterns could be explained by Kathleen's own movements, coughing, slipping, and attempting to stand as she bled. They brought forward their own experts, who disputed the interpretation of the blood evidence and emphasized the absence of skull fractures, which they argued would be expected in a sustained beating. Michael Peterson took the stand in his own defense. He spoke calmly, maintained his account. He described the evening by the pool, the moment he found Kathleen, his attempts to help her. He denied any argument, any violence, any involvement in her death. Under cross-examination, prosecutors focused on his credibility, his bisexual relationships, his financial situation. His past writings included fictional works that contained violent imagery. They suggested that beneath his composed exterior was a man capable of constructing a narrative and living inside it. The defense pushed back, framing the case as a tragic accident distorted by assumption. They argued that the prosecution had built its theory on interpretation rather than certainty. There was no direct evidence, no eyewitness, no weapon, no confession, placing Michael Peterson as a killer. After weeks of testimony, the jury faced conflicting expert opinions and debated evidence. Two different narratives emerged surrounding one staircase and one death. The central, unresolved question was this a murder disguised as an accident, or a genuine tragedy misinterpreted due to suspicion? The verdict, when it came in October 2003, appeared to bring finality. Michael Peterson was found guilty of the murder of Kathleen Peterson. The jury, after deliberation, accepted the prosecution's narrative that the death on the staircase was not an accident, but an act of violence. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For years, the case seemed settled. But beneath the surface, something had already begun to shift. Dwayne Deaver, an analyst at the State Bureau of Investigation, was central to this change. His testimony, especially his bloodstain analysis, was key in convicting Michael Peterson. Deaver's analysis heavily influenced the jury's understanding of the crime scene and directly connected Peterson to the alleged attack. Then, years later, those conclusions began to unravel. According to internal investigations conducted by the North Carolina SBI, Deaver's work in multiple cases, not just Peterson's, was found to be deeply flawed. Reports indicated that he had overstated findings, misrepresented results, and, in some instances, provided testimony that exceeded what the evidence could scientifically support. In 2011, Deaver was dismissed from the SBI. The implications were immediate and profound. Defense attorneys filed motions arguing that Peterson's conviction had been tainted by unreliable forensic testimony. According to court filings, Deaver's analysis had not only influenced the jury, it had framed the entire narrative of the prosecution's case. A judge agreed to re-examine the matter. In December 2011, after extensive hearings, Superior Court Judge Orlando Hudson ruled that Michael Peterson was entitled to a new trial. The decision was based on the conclusion that Deaver's testimony had been materially misleading and that the jury had been presented with evidence that could not be considered scientifically sound. After 8 years in prison, Michael Peterson was released on bail. The case, once thought resolved, was reopened. But the passage of time had changed everything. Witnesses had aged. Memories had faded. Evidence, once fresh, now carried the weight of reinterpretation. The certainty that had once defined the verdict began to dissolve into doubt. The justice system, meant to provide clear answers, was now being questioned. How much of the initial conviction was based on shaky evidence? And if the basis of the conviction was wrong, what could still be considered reliable? The case was no longer simply about the events on the staircase. It had evolved into a challenge to the integrity of the justice system. The conclusion wouldn't offer definitive proof, but rather a negotiated agreement. By 2017, the case had stretched across 16 years. What began as a late-night emergency call had evolved into one of the most debated criminal cases in modern American legal history. A conviction had been secured, then weakened, then undone. What remained was not resolution, but exhaustion. The prosecution faced a decision. Retrying the case would mean reconstructing a narrative from aging evidence and witnesses whose memories had inevitably eroded. The defense, meanwhile, stood firm in its position that Michael Peterson had never committed a crime, that Kathleen's death was a tragic accident misinterpreted through flawed forensic analysis. Neither side held absolute certainty anymore. In February 2017, Michael Peterson entered what is legally known as an Alford plea. He formally pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, but crucially, he did not admit to committing the crime. Instead, he acknowledged that the prosecution possessed enough evidence that a jury could likely convict him again. The court accepted the plea. He was sentenced to the time already served. Michael Peterson walked free. Legally, the case reached its conclusion. But factually, it remained unresolved. There was no definitive reconstruction of Kathleen Peterson's final moments that satisfied all the evidence. The prosecution's theory of homicide had been weakened by discredited forensic testimony. The defense's theory of accidental fall, while plausible to some experts, did not fully explain every injury, every blood pattern, every inconsistency in timing. Alternative theories emerged over time, including one involving a possible owl attack outside the home, suggested by defense consultants years later. This theory, while supported by certain physical details such as microscopic feathers found at the scene, was never tested in court and remains unproven. In the absence of certainty, the case settled into ambiguity. Kathleen Peterson's family was left with a loss that no verdict could fully address. Some members continued to believe in Michael's guilt. Others expressed doubt. The division itself became part of the aftermath. For the legal system, the case raised enduring questions about the reliability of forensic science, the influence of expert testimony, and the fragile boundary between interpretation and fact. The Cedar Street staircase remains a source of unresolved tension for those who examine the case. Two possibilities linger: a violent act or an accident. Neither has been definitively proven or disproven. The case provides no resolution, only a persistent question. How close can justice get to the truth when the truth itself remains elusive?